Hello and welcome to World MISHA Day. I am Cher Schneider, Head of Conservation at the New York State Education Department in the Office of Cultural Education located in Albany, New York. I wanted to tell you how a presentation in Salt Lake City, Utah changed my conservation practices and quite frankly was desperately needed to aid in the preservation and access of our collections. This slide is a timeline of my journey with MISHA. I want to walk you through how my MISHA journey affected me professionally. In May of 24, this was my first contact with MISHA at the AIC annual meeting. After Izzy Moyer's presentation, I had one question. Has anyone used MISHA for burnt documents? No one had, and so began my journey. In August of 24, MISHA came for an OCE site visit. This is where our formal collaboration with RIT's Cultural Heritage Imaging Lab started. In March of 25, we began our on-site pilot project. RIT came back to OCE to image a discrete project from our library collection, and I will show you what that looks like in a few minutes. In July of 25, I attended RIT's first MISHA summer seminar. This past fall and winter, I began purchasing MISHA equipment for my lab. In June, we plan to have a second site visit with RIT to continue imaging and processing from the pilot project. I want to talk about how we are still moving forward and what hurdles and goals we still have set with the MISHA system and partnership. So let's look into this journey in a little more depth. So what is MISHA and why did I begin this journey? It's attainable, it works, and it was built for us. The complete system is under $10,000. It is small, portable, and adaptable. The software is free and open source, and it has been publicly available since 2024 thanks to an NEH grant. MISHA captures reflected light across 16 wavelengths from UV to near IR. The documents are illuminated sequentially in a darkened space that you can create yourself, producing an image stack or data cube that is processed with the open source software to reveal information invisible to standard examination or imaging. It's designed specifically for cultural heritage institutions, libraries, archives, and museums, and for the practitioners without access to high-end systems or dedicated imaging staff. It's not adapted for us, it's built for us, and that distinction matters. For me, MISHA was an opportunity to build research-based educational collaborations across New York State, and that goal continues to drive the work. The New York State Education Department Office of Cultural Education encompasses the New York State Library, Archives, and Museum. Housed in a building with over 150 million square feet, most of it collection space, plus several off-site facilities. Just one of our collections holds over 10 million specimens. Following AIC in August of 2024, Izzy Moyer brought the full MISHA system to OCE. We used the visit as a cross-institutional teaching opportunity, inviting staff from the library, archives, and museum to participate. The day combined demonstration with hands-on investigation. Each institution brought items to be imaged, and the group witnessed the process firsthand, with immediate results showing how MISHA reveals lost information. Our central question, could this work on our most damaged holdings? The answer was a resounding yes. Soon after starting at OCE, I realized the biggest preservation issue was the burnt and damaged items in our collection. In 1911, a fire destroyed a significant portion of the New York State Library's collection, including over 750,000 items, including books, manuscripts, and documents. Today, the State Library and the archives still contain hundreds of thousands of burnt leaves from that fire that are just inaccessible. Fire damage is unlike most other damages that conservators encounter. The fire not only damages the paper, but it changes its chemical and physical structure, leaving charred remains that are fragile and blackened, quite often with additional water damage. This damage is often irreversible with conservation treatment. I had a previous collection digitized with IR imaging, but there was no success at retrieving that information. This is just one example of the images from the initial visit. This document is from the New York State Archives collection, The Children of Free Slaves. It was treated and digitized document through the NEH Save America's Treasures grant. And the archivists were very concerned about the treatment because, one, some of the edge paper was lost during treatment, which is not uncommon, and two, the false margins strengthened the edges, further obstructed the visibility of the information. But you can see the lost and obstructed information is clearly legible with the use of the MISHA system and processing with the false color, seen on the 3 right images. In March of 2025, Julie Decker and 3 RIT students came to OCE for 3 working days. I had decided to focus on a discrete project from the Van Rensselaer Manor papers in our library's collection. These 3 days of working included over 20 hours of imaging and processing and over 75 documents being imaged, and we really used it as a learning opportunity. As a conservator, you spend your career stabilizing what's there, reversing to an extent the damage, but mainly slowing the loss and damage. You don't always get to recover what's already gone. MISHA changed my treatment protocol for our burnt collections. In OCE, we have halted all conservation treatment on the burnt documents, and we are looking to image with MISHA so we can gather and make all the information accessible before conservation treatment when we can. The Van Rensselaer Manor papers are one of the most important archival collections in the New York State Library. They document more than 200 years of daily life in the oldest permanently settled region of North America. This collection includes letters, land transactions, records of material culture, personal stories, maps, and ledgers. Historians, genealogists, archaeologists, and lawyers all use this collection. However, most of the collection has been inaccessible for 114 years. And that is why myself and Elizabeth Jakubowski, the head of manuscripts and special collections, are looking to change. The pilot project in March of 2025 was a full 3 days of working with MISHA. The RIT team didn't just image the collection and leave. They worked alongside OCE conservation staff, explaining every step and transferring their knowledge. The excitement for what they do is infectious and very much appreciated. We had a few staff visit, watch and learn, and the RIT team was very adaptable and helped everyone. We even had a visitor from SUNY Preservation, making it truly a collaborative space. This is one of the results from our pilot project. I wanted to give you a moment to look at it. It is from the Van Rensselaer Manor Papers in box 51. On the left is what these documents look like under standard visible light. And as you can see, all the edges are darkened and black, unreadable. But on the right, you can really see what MISHA reveals. The information becomes highlighted, visible, and legible. This is the second example from our pilot project, and I really wanted you to see an example of a false color. And what you are really seeing is on the blackened edges where the information is not visible. Within the green and the light blue teal color, you can see that all of the information becomes accessible. And what's really exciting for us and why this is so important in this time frame is that we have staff retiring, some of which are the last people to be able to read Old Dutch that is contained on these documents. So for us, this couldn't be better timing collegial relationship. In July of 2025, I attended RIT's inaugural MISHA Summer Seminar, a week-long intensive led by Julie Decker and Dr. David Messenger, with 30 participants from cultural heritage institutions across the country. Sunday was arrival and a reception, which was a good opportunity to meet fellow participants and get oriented to the seminar location. Monday focused on lectures covering the history and science behind MISHA, including a live demo. Tuesday continued with morning lectures on previous iterations and modifications to the system, followed by hands-on small group sessions where we assembled MISHA from its components and captured images. Wednesday, we rebuilt the systems in small groups, then processed both known and unknown samples. The afternoon included visits to RIT's imaging science lab facilities. Thursday featured campus tours, and we saw student project presentations and had additional processing time. Friday was just a half a day, and we did wrap up with a recap, Q&A, and then of course seminar evaluations. I left feeling confident and fully equipped. I can assemble the system, image collections independently, process the results, and advocate for MISHA within OCE and in our field. If you have a MISHA system or are considering one, I can't recommend the seminar strong enough. One of the seminar's most memorable moments was the imaging and processing day. Participants worked hands-on with the full pipeline, imaging and after processing, using agate leaves, paintings, and artifact fragments. Processing is time-consuming and genuinely all-consuming. The options for revealing hidden information are endless. And as the experts noted, they often return to the data cube days, weeks, months, or even years later to extract more information. That ongoing potential is one of MISHA's greatest strengths. For me, the highlight was processing images previously captured at OCE, working with our own material for the first time. Doing it yourself with your own collections is a completely different experience from watching. Being able to process and ask questions simultaneously helps solidify knowledge that is otherwise complex, the color science especially. If you learn by doing, this day alone makes the seminar worth attending. We are not stopping our collaboration with RIT. In June of this year, the RIT team will return to OCE for 3 more working days, building on the March 2025 pilot project. We plan to continue imaging and processing the Van Rensselaer Manor papers for continuing imaging, but we have a few other things we want to investigate as well. In conservation, we are currently stabilizing a set of 71 hand-drawn and painted oversized maps of the Erie, Champlain, and Oswego canals that are due to be digitized for the New York State Archives. This collection is 92.4 cubic feet of material spanning from 1825 to 1896. Named after George L. Schillner, a New York State civil engineer and map maker. They document land ownership, canal structures, locks, bridges, roads, municipal boundaries, and property lines. These maps are invaluable, and I will say beautiful, as they contain layers of New York State history, but they also contain handwritten inscriptions in graphite from the engineers that are increasingly difficult to read due to fading and smudging of the graphite. I know that the MISHA system will be particularly effective at recovering fading graphite. However, the size of these maps will be a fun challenge, as they are generally about 6 foot by 6 foot. These maps are a priority for the New York State Archives, and they are an ideal next candidate for MISHA imaging. I want to be honest about where we are, the hurdles, and the goals we're still working towards. Hopefully, our experience helps smooth your path with MISHA. As a state institution, purchasing components custom manufactured in China presents real procurement complications we're actively working through. Costs have also risen sharply. Light panels alone have more than doubled in price. This has significantly slowed our goal of building an in-house workflow. In the meantime, RIT continues to lend systems and visit on site, so imaging continues. I'm also working with RIT and peer institutions to find easier purchasing pathways for the lighting panels. Federal funding changes have cascaded to a state level, creating budget stress that has stalled in-house equipment purchase multiple times this fiscal year. They also prevented a planned 2025 RIT OCE summer internship from moving forward. I've always intended MISHA as a training tool for conservation interns, but the absence of MOUs with state institutions has limited compensating student placements. I'm working with new leadership on pathways to address this. The work is too important to stop. Progress is glacial, but it's progress. My mantra, image, 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 then process, process, process. RIT's continued support keeps us moving while we work towards full in-house independence. How to keep moving forward. Share your information with RIT's database. Join AIC's imaging group. Connect with MISHA partners. Once I have a full in-house system running, the goal is to open it to other OCE departments and institutions. It is a tight-knit, knowledgeable, and welcoming community. Lean on it. My vision for internships includes a sustained multi-year collaboration between RIT and OCE, and institutions like ours that would benefit from its collections, researchers, and students simultaneously. New York State Education Department has the existing MOU with SUNY that creates a clear pathway for students to participate as interns in active collections work. We want library science students, archival study students, conservation students, and RIT imaging science students to all work together on real collections with real equipment. This is not a one-time event. We envision ongoing collaboration spanning years, working through backlogs of damaged materials across New York State collection. That is the vision, and I think it's within reach. I would like to say a huge thank you to Dr. Julie Decker, Dr. David Messenger, Dr. Roger Easton Jr., and the entire RIT MISHA team. You have built something remarkable, and you have been extraordinary partners. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at OCE, and if anyone would like to connect, please reach out. My information is on the slide. This work matters. I hope my journey will inspire you to be a part of it, and I look forward to hearing about your MISHA journey.
Hi everyone, my name is Kayla. I am a graduate student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I'm currently finishing up my graduate degree in Heritage Studies and Public History, and my capstone for my program revolves around the use of MISHA at non-collegiate institutions. My central research question really centers around the ease of transport, assembly, ease of capture, and ease of software navigation. And the reason I chose this project was because of my background as a community archivist. Formerly, I was the head archivist for a community archive in a place called Rondo, a historically Black neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota. And during my work there and also with the indigenous communities here, namely the Lakota and Dakota communities, I've been exposed to a bunch of people who would love to work with these materials, but a historic wariness towards predominantly white institutions and academic spaces make it hard for collaborations to occur. And so many of these institutions look to use MISHA on their own terms. And I think that MISHA is an incredibly useful tool. And I want to be able to communicate the strengths and the limitations of MISHA so that smaller institutions and non-university affiliated groups can have a realistic view of what it means to use this technology. So the institutions that I worked predominantly with four of them: the Weizmann Art Museum, the Science Museum of Minnesota, Ramsey County Historical Society, and George Latimer Central Library. When I was collaborating with these institutions, I stressed that the materials selected for this project were A, useful to the current or political cultural heritage initiatives that target public audiences, and that two, wherever possible, materials selected for imaging originated in the Americas with a strong preference for creating use cases for Black and Indigenous cultural heritage artifacts. The first institution is affiliated with the University of Minnesota, and it did provide a sort of useful control group of sorts. Because the Weizmann allowed me to compare the experience of working within academia with on this project to those outside of it. And more importantly, they provided me with access to paintings that I could use to test the utility and limitations of MISHA on the back end, which kind of was a very big deal. And I'll explain why in the next slide. The other thing to mention as we're looking at the institutional research questions, a lot of these institutions are predominantly looking at, like, can we identify forgeries, identify reproductions, can we make the message easier to read or reveal underpaintings or drawings on various materials. And to be clear, I'm not a subject matter expert in all of the material culture types presented in the data collected. While I do, like, I did collect the data and generate a few PCA results. Interpretation of that data will need subject matter expertise, which is more time than my capstone allowed. Again, my focus is on documenting the ease of use so that others can learn and improve upon my experience. Okay, so the challenges that I was facing when using MISHA were reorientation, stitching, and other prep for analysis software. So I did 3D image some ceramics for this project, and that did involve reorienting the system so that it could capture it in that way. You can see in image A, I have, when I was test setting it up, I did use a can as my test there. And that took a little bit to learn and get used to. And then also like angling the lights correctly was something that I need to be very aware of. Stitching. Stitching was a big thing. So I had many of the objects that I worked with were too big for the camera's field of vision to capture in one go, which meant that I needed to capture large materials in segments and then work on stitching them later. I would attempt to stitch them in Photoshop, which was fine for some to do photo merge and auto alignment. So I would align the photos first to themselves and then align the layers together so that everything was in the same location so that it would be accepted by the analysis software. With that being said, while I did have success with that auto aligning process, other ones required much more in-depth processing, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Yeah, let's see. Image C is a plat map, which I was really excited to image. Other things that are important about stitching is because I wanted to align the layers to themselves as perfectly as I could. When I did this in Photoshop, that did mean I had to kind of trim off where the alignment wasn't perfect. Yes, things to keep in mind when you're segmenting, collecting images in segments. So this is the big thing that I was really excited to work on. As a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, I am a graduate assistant at a place called ASOS, the Advanced Imaging Service for Objects and Spaces. And there, my boss, Dr. Porter, who runs that lab, helped me to navigate photo merging outside of Photoshop with great success. She introduced me to Agisoft Metashape, which is a software you can see on your screen. And I used it to stitch together. It's normally used for stitching together thousands of images for analysis, such as micromorphology slides or even like entire environments just outside in the world. It captures images and then creates a 3D space for them. It typically needs about 50% overlap for ideal photo alignment. You can make do with slightly less, but it does require quite like a high volume of photos. And with my project, because I was doing this on the back end, I didn't really think to take that many photos. So we were really working at the limits of this technology. Her process does take a few hours, which is better than most from what I hear. I know some people have taken weeks or up to a month using Adobe Photoshop to try to align these. And this takes between 2 or 3 hours, depending on how familiar you are with the software. You start with sorted copies and then you go into Metashape. Again, Metashape thinks in 3D space. And because when you send it to MISHA, the file sizes can only be so big, you need to take it to a 3D modeling software like Maya or Blender and flatten the vertices to 0 and then send it back into Metashape so that you can have a nice like template for where the images need to go for ideal alignment. And then you can automate the process of taking in all of the other images from each of the other bands and mapping them right onto that template that you've created. And then from there, you go into Photoshop for some final cropping. And that cropping is important because I tried to do it without the cropping, and because the file sizes were so large, my laptop didn't have enough RAM. You can get around that by using a computer with more RAM. But between that and the fact that Agisoft, Blender, and Photoshop cost money and time to learn, that does kind of undermine the attractiveness of Misha, with it being low cost, low barrier to entry, and being an end-to-end technology. There are also many opportunities for user error in this process. Dr. Porter was kind enough to record using Agisoft Metashape for me, but even then there are some like tweaks that need to be made depending on what exactly you're trying to overlap. And there are hundreds of buttons that you could accidentally click. And when you have when you're working with like 8 images that each have 16 different images that correspond to the light bands, that's the permutations of where things can go wrong are exponential. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, and this is my last slide. How great. Okay. So this is all of which to say is that Dr. Porter's process, while a success and maybe could be the start of what is a standard for stitching together materials, is a more involved process than a simple point and shoot Kodak camera, and it is a more involved process than sending things straight from Misha image capture to Misha's analysis software. Dr. Porter's process involves resources, recurring money, excess time, and refined technological skills that smaller institutions that hold BIPOC records may not have or will need to rely on university services to get help for. And that does come at a cost of seeming to be extractive, which we don't want to do. We want to empower smaller institutions to be able to do what they need. And I try not to let perfect be the enemy of good. So without RIT dedicating resources to projects like Misha, or the University of Minnesota, dedicating resources to staffing labs like ASOS, I wouldn't have been able to introduce these technologies to institutions who are interested in using them. I think there's a kind of culture around rugged individualism and a valid earned distrust of predominantly white institutions that lends itself to sort of anti-intellectualism or apprehension with collaborating with institutions, bigger institutions. But collaboration does benefit, well, most people, I think. This project for me was a collaborative effort, and I'm very, very grateful to everyone who's helped me. And again, my hope is that by sharing my experiences with troubleshooting with Misha, other people can learn from it and it can be shared out. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. You are welcome to contact me via email if you have any other questions. And thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Bob Hickson. I'm the imaging system specialist at the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut. I want to start off by thanking the Misha team for inviting me to participate in this. This is a very big honor. I attended the Misha summer seminar last year, and I remember on my 7-hour drive up to Rochester thinking to myself, studying multispectral imaging at the Rochester Institute of Technology does not sound like a day at the beach. But to my surprise, it kind of was, because the Misha team built something that's so user-friendly, even a simple country photographer like myself can use it with great success. So let's begin. First off, I did have access to a Misha capture system here at the YCBA. In conjunction with the Yale University Art Gallery, we borrowed a Misha, and each institution spent about a week with it. I'm not going to get too deep into the capture process because my friend Rich House from the Yale University Art Gallery is going to do a deep dive into that a little later. So stay tuned for that. But this is one or two examples of what I got photographing with the MISHA equipment. But my project was to dig into our archive and see if I could discover anything. We have about 400,000 assets. And what I needed to do was find images, find objects. And this is the first one, a young daughter of the Picts from 1585. And I needed images of this in visible, ultraviolet, and infrared. And I was able to find those. Now, to build a MISHA cube, which we'll go over in a minute, these files all need to be in register. And I'm sure the first thing you noticed was the infrared shot is much smaller. That's because this was photographed with a Nikon DSLR, while these two were photographed with a Hasselblad. But even the two Hasselblad shots, you could see that the ultraviolet shot, the object is sitting lower in the frame. So these three files are nowhere near in register. So we could fix that. And to do that, we're going to head over to Photoshop. All right, so we are in Photoshop. First step to get these things in register was to reduce the size of the Hasselblad shots so that they are as close as I can get them to the Nikon infrared shot. And I have now a layered document with top layer being the infrared shot, followed by the ultraviolet, and then the visible. Now, through experience, I've learned that the images taken with the Nikon have a little bit of barrel distortion that needs to be fixed. And it's very easy. I just activate that layer, go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, head down to Optics, and just put one in. That's all you need, just a little bit of a nudge. And if I go to the before and after, you can see the image changing. Hit OK. Now I can go about aligning these images. And from this magnification, they seem to be in register with each other, but in fact, they're not. They're not close enough. So we have to solve this problem. Now, there are many ways to do this. One of them is auto-align layers in Photoshop. Unfortunately, I've met with very little success using that approach. So I've stopped trying, and I'm doing it my way, the Bob way. So what I've done for each layer, I find a landmark in all four corners, and I put a small white dot. And I'm going to use that to align the layers. And then I use a couple of guides to basically put a crosshair on that dot. If we shift over to the ultraviolet image, we can see that dot is not lined up. Neither is the infrared. So to solve this, I activate my layer for the ultraviolet. I go to Edit, Transform, Distort. I grab the corner and I simply drag it to position the dot on the crosshair. And sometimes you can't get it perfect, but you can get it very close. Hit return. Do the same for the ultraviolet. Do all four corners. And then I usually go around all four corners once more just to fine tune things. At that point, your images are basically in register. After the images are in alignment, I will then save each layer out as its own document. Here's the visible layer again by itself. MISHA wants grayscale images. So it's a simple matter of dividing up the color channels. And while I'm over here in the channels palette, I just go to the menu and I go to split channels, and voila, I have 3 files. This is the red channel, green channel, blue channel. I save them out as separate documents, and I end up with this. At this point, we head over to MISHA and we build a cube. All right, so we're in MISHA, and the process of building a cube is very straightforward. Do I want to build a cube? Yes, I do. I direct MISHA to my folder of images. I select them, hit open, and they are loaded. I don't want to select an image for flat fielding because I don't have one. And I don't have a cube to calibrate. Next, I save my cube. MISHA demo, right back to the same folder. Successfully saved. Do I want to open it? Yes, I do. So we have a cube. Now, the first thing you could do if you were curious is you could switch this toggle over to grayscale. And with this button, you can cycle through your images just to see what you've got and where they landed up, what band. The band is up here. Flip it back to RGB. And now you can mix and match these bands to produce, what I try to do is produce an image that has the most contrast between colors. And in this case, I know that band 1, 5, and 2 give me a pretty interesting image. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to go to analysis. We have a choice of maximum noise fraction, principal component analysis. These are the ones that I use most often. And I'm going to run these, but to save time, just like in our favorite cooking shows, I have a couple already in the oven. And here is the principal component analysis. And it's a very interesting image. I think this is very successful. A lot of contrast, a lot of things a conservator can poke around in. I also did a maximum noise fraction. What stands out to me in this one, and a conservator pointed this out, was it appears the artist altered their technique for rendering this tree, whether it was above or below the horizon. Found that to be a very interesting tidbit. Here are the two side by side, and this is the PCA at approximately 100%. So as you can see, if your registration is successful, you end up with a pretty sharp image. We're going to move on now to The Brown Teapot by Gwen John. This is an object that I photographed in infrared with our Apollo camera. I created 3 files, each targeting a specific area of the IR spectrum. And I thought, what would happen if I built a cube just out of infrared images? It could be very boring, or it could be interesting. Only one way to find out. I went ahead. And what I think happened was pretty interesting. This is a PCA. You can clearly see the underpainting. See how the artist mapped out this image. And you also can get a hint at various materials that are hiding underneath the surface layer of paint. So that was a very pleasant surprise. Here, you remember this is one of the objects I photographed with the MISHA capture system. Well, we also happen to have a painting by the same artist. And I also photographed this with the MISHA. And this is it on the left, photograph with the MISHA. This image on the right is my approach with images from our archive, but in this case, I only had visible spectrum and infrared. No UV on this one. So I decided I'd get a little fancy, and I added an X-ray. This, I find it to be fascinating. I don't know enough to explain what I'm seeing, but a conservator certainly would. So that was a very interesting thing. Lastly, we have the first Marquis of Winchester. This is a painting that our conservation department had produced a series of XRF scans. These top 5 and these bottom 2 are all macro XRF scans. These 3 are the red, green, and blue channels of a Hasselblad shot in the visible spectrum. So I decided to bring everything into register and build a cube. And I was surprised at what I saw. This is just what I call the base cube. And I've never seen one this vivid. I've done nothing to these images, no saturation, no hue adjustments. This is just how the MISHA software presented it. Now, the one area where we're kind of missing the boat, if you notice very faintly, there's a sash over this gentleman's left shoulder, and it's not really showing up here. But then we ran principal component analysis and maximum noise fraction. Now, on the right maximum noise fraction, again, the sash doesn't really show. Principal component analysis, there it is. So it's telling us something. The other thing that this is telling us is that this ruffled collar is very much sitting off on its own. Where over here, it's not far off from skin tones or the highlight on this staff. But the highlight on the staff, collar, and the skin tones over in PCA are drastically different. So I think that's the winner in this case. Again, not to repeat myself, but at this point, I would hand this off to a conservator who would be able to decipher this in detail. But that's something that'll come later on. So that's all I have. I hope it didn't go too long. I want to thank you all for putting up with me. I want to thank the MISHA team again for inviting me. And I look forward to the next presentation. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Richard Dudas. I am professor of composition and music technology at Hanyang University here in Seoul, South Korea. In addition to doing composition and computer music, I also have a strong involvement with the decipherment and reconstruction of medieval musical fragments, which is how MISHA fits into this presentation. So thank you for having me here at the second World Wide MISHA Day. It's actually a day later here in Seoul, so I'm grateful that you were able to schedule me toward the beginning of the program. This presentation is about my using the MISHA spectral image analysis environment software to process images that are not strictly multispectral in their origin. Specifically, these are a set of images of a 14th century musical fragment at the library of the Franciscan cloister in Würzburg, Germany, which were taken with a normal camera under 2 very different lighting scenarios. But my journey here with MISHA actually begins in Rochester. Last spring, I visited the Sibley Music Library's Ruth T. Watanabe Special Collections at the University of Rochester's Eastman School of Music to see a damaged parchment leaf from the library's Oscar Fleischer collection. This preserves the second half of a nearly unique chasse. A chasse, which is quite literally a chase, is a 14th century musical form where musical lines chase each other. This is also known as a canon or round. And if you know the song Frère Jacques or Are You Sleeping Brother John, Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous, then you know what a canon or a round is. And consequently, you know what a chasse is. Now I say this is nominally unique because there's actually a little fragment of the very end of it, about half a dozen notes and a few lines of text that are in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. But really, this is the larger, the more important fragment. It preserves about half of the piece, and it is right there in Rochester. As you can see, however, it's heavily damaged. It was pasted down to the inside of a book cover at one point in time. And because of this damage, no one had really tried to reconstruct it to make it playable, let's say. I mean, people have reconstructed it to some extent, but last year I actually decided to put it together, which is why I visited the Sibley Library. When I visited the library, I noticed that many illegible areas responded quite well to ultraviolet light, since the parchment fluoresces into the visible spectrum when the light hits it. This is one of the areas that actually comes across very well, that fluoresces quite well. But some parts of the manuscript, the fragment, remained illegible in spite of this. So I made a request to the Special Collections librarian, David Peter Koppen, if they could possibly re-image this under ultraviolet light or multispectral imaging. Little did I know at that time that the Rochester Institute of Technology had developed a multispectral imaging system for historical artifacts, i.e. MISHA. So when I finally received the multispectral images undertaken by Julie Decker and the MISHA team, I went straight to work to try to process them in a way that rendered even the most damaged areas of text largely legible. A great success. With this new false color image composed of a multispectral cube of images captured by MISHA and processed with the MISHA spectral imaging analysis environment, among some other image processing tools, I managed to decipher pretty much all but one pesky word right here. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but there's one word down there that I'm still struggling to figure out, to make some sense of. Another bit of software that I'd like to give a shout out to about is the Hydra HDR image processing software. It's a Franco-Belgian team that has made it. It's Macintosh only, but it has some nice tools for spectral processing, as well as hue rotation that works particularly well with the colorful images that come from processed multispectral image sets. So after the success with this fragment, my thoughts turned to another 14th century musical fragment, the one held at the Franciscan cloister in Würzburg. Here's an image of it. I'd actually visited this fragment on a research trip last year and noted that there were some similarities between it physically and the Fleischer fragment at the Sibley Library. Both leaves contain similar damage. They were both pasted to their respective book covers at one point in time. They both contain unique musical compositions that really don't appear anywhere else, yet at least. And they had not been transcribed because of their damaged state. And I noticed that this leaf also responded quite well to ultraviolet light fluorescence. Not perfectly, but to some degree. The UV fluorescence image that you see here is one that I took, but a decade ago, an excellent set of images were taken by medieval music researcher David Catalunya under both white light and ultraviolet fluorescence illumination, and he was kind enough to share these with me. The ultraviolet image that he took, which you can see at the bottom, as you can see, it's quite a bit clearer in many places than the ambient light image, but not everything could easily be read on that image, nor on the images that I took when I visited the fragment. What I did realize, however, is that his two images were very well registered, and that together they actually formed a set of 6 discrete images, to 6 discrete channels of information, let's just say, from the 2 red, green, blue RGB images. And I realized that I could treat these 6 images as a sort of faux multispectral set and make use of the MISHA spectral image analysis environment software to process them analogously to a genuine MSI set. So this is very much the same process as the previous presenter, Bob Hickson, used. And my results were obviously not a replacement for an eventual actual multispectral imaging of this damaged source, but they did offer a great improvement on visibility of some parts of these leaves, and improved my readings of the damaged text, or the text in the most damaged areas of the parchment, but not really in the most damaged areas. There's this one spot here where there's actually a tear, a physical tear in the parchment, and I fear that those words may be forever lost. But we'll see. Who knows what the future holds? I tried several different combinations of processed images from the MISHA software, and different images, different combinations of principal component analysis actually revealed different parts of the damaged text. In the more damaged bottom portion of this leaf, which is shown here, it's hard to read, especially you can see in the middle of that, that's the text may be entirely rubbed out. But I was nonetheless able to more clearly decipher a few words here and there and confirm some of my tentative readings of others on this part of the page, including one place here, which it starts up there, but it says humble chaleur amoureuse, humble, loving warmth. And the result is that I now have the vast majority of the two poetic texts for this piece of music. And it's basically a medieval courtly love song. The first text, my lady, pleasant in a single memory, and even more so in one single glance. And the other texts, too much is the gentle pain which I must endure out of my loyal desire, inflamed by humble loving warmth. So there's our text, our deciphered text there at the beginning, at the end of the first stanza. Now this is interesting. It doesn't seem too far from something like the Beatles' Michel Ma Belle. So I guess the emotions and feelings of pop songwriters haven't changed all that much in 700 years. But anyway, it was a great success to process these non-multispectral images as if they were multispectral, and actually eke some more out of them than I was able to on the red, green, blue images alone. So I would, of course, like to thank Julie Decker, David Messinger, Roger Easton, and the entire MISHA team. And a new name that I learned while I was waiting for this MISHA Day festivities to start, Lily Kelly, who was responsible for some of the early MISHA software, early implementations at least. I'd also like to thank David Peter Koppen at the Sibley Music Library, David Catalunya for sharing his photos with me, Frater Andreas Fiebach at the Franciscan Cloister in Würzburg for his enthusiasm about this musical fragment, as well as Larry Arp, Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who provided copious amounts of feedback on my musical transcription and reconstructed texts. Thank you all. 감사합니다.
It also have stamp and the red rocks. So the captain, when he came back from the ship, he was abroad. This was a merchant ship, and the captain must return this maritime permit to the archive, to the Chancellery of the Archive, and the archive recycle it. Recycle this kind of documents. And the second palimpsest that we found is from a book from the Dominican monastery. I found out that this is for a text. It is a poem, and this poem is from the Spanish priest Thomas Louis de Victoria, and it is from 16th century. And as you also know, the MISHA is being so useful for the damaged papers and the text. We also, this year, we collaborate with the Croatian Institute of History. They have a project, and they couldn't read all the text that was in front of them, and they asked us could it be scanned by MISHA system, and also we scanned it, analyzed it, and the professors from the Croatian Institute of History were very satisfied, and they were very glad that we have this system in our archive. So from me, this is it, and my colleague Anna will now speak about the librarian books that also we keep in our archive.
And I will just shortly tell you something about our library and things I've been doing. So we have more than 50,000 items in the library. And the most interesting is our Rogozina collection. It has more than 800 very old and rare books. So when I started to study these books, I found something interesting. So old pieces of paper and parchment are hidden inside the covers and spine. And in the past, the paper was very expensive. So binders recycled old, let's say useless manuscripts to make the new book covers stronger. And I've read somewhere that 1 of every 5 old books has these hidden traces. So it's really interesting. And when I find a book like this, I put it on a MISHA, and I will show you now several books where I've found some interesting texts. So this is the first one. And in this book, I found the document that was glued to the back of the first page. We can see that the text is in German, and at the bottom, you can see it says Triest M, so it's from Thirst. Okay, so you can see the first picture, it's the original, the second one, and the third one is after I've scanned it with MISHA. So here you can see that the text is on a German, and you can see the school terms for subjects like math, writing, and Latin. So I'll send it to the experts in the archives in Trieste, and they helped me understand that this document is from the late 18th or early 19th century, and that this was common in the Adriatic region during the Habsburg time. Also, I have found a watermark that proves that paper is from that specific time and place. And it's really interesting to see that the book that was printed in 1764 was probably did not have any bindings until the time that we found this document. So Vedran, if you can put the next slide. Okay, thank you. So this next example is also really nice. And okay, I can see in the chat, thank you. So this is a piece of a music page and text, and it was glued on the back cover of the book. So the cover is 42 by 28 centimeters, so it's really large. And because it's so big, I think that it came from a very large medieval core book. I believe that this fragment is part of the famous hymn Pange Lingua, written by Thomas Aquinas. And I believe it's a medieval manuscript because it has a 4-line staff and square music notes. And this style of writing music was typical for that period. And you can put the next one, please, Vedran. Okay, so this is the last one. Here we see a printed form. It's probably some kind of a text document. It was used as a waste paper just to help build the book cover. So even though it was used as a scrap material, the German text is still easy to read. And I'm still studying this document to find out exactly where it came from. But a lot of things can be read after the MISHA scanning. So this is really changing how we study old books, and for hundreds of years, librarians saw these fragments inside of the books, but didn't know what they were. So today we can finally read the secrets hidden inside the book covers, and this really helps us understand how books were made and their long history. And often these pieces, these hidden pieces are much older than the books they protect. So I really wonder what other treasures are still waiting to be found. Thank you.
That is very familiar. That's the watermark from the Dunlop broadside of the Declaration of Independence.
Really?
Library of Congress. And I was going to go look for it. I don't have it on this laptop. It's downstairs. I'll go find it and bring it up and post it at some convenient time. But I'm almost certain it's exactly the same one.
So meaning it's the same paper. So when you were suggesting late 18th, early 19th century, that might tilt it a little bit more towards late 18th, like 1770s, that kind of.
And it's also, we think, the same watermark from that Beethoven that we saw down at the Sibley.
Which I'm not sure we're supposed to talk about that, Roger, but yes, it is the same watermark that is at manuscript in the Sibley Library, a musical manuscript that has the same watermark, and it's by Beethoven. He intentionally used the date on that item is unclear, and so it's assumed now that he pulled a piece of paper from the 18th century as opposed to early 19th when that manuscript was presumed to have been written. So that's fantastic. That's really exciting to see.
Brilliant. Nice.
Congratulations.
Welcome to the MISHA team, Anna.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Looks like you're doing good
Really
stuff.
exciting.
Very good. Fantastic. Thank you, friends. Thank you so much.
Okay. Actually, we should probably introduce ourselves first. I'm Stephanie Leahy. I'm the Andrews Fellow in Book Science at the University of Toronto, affiliated with the Old Books New Science Lab.
Hi, I'm Rachel DeCrush. I'm a Special Collections Librarian for Book Science at the Thomas Fisher Ware Book Library at the University of Toronto. And I work closely with Stephanie on some of these Andrews-related projects, and happy to share some of them with you now. So I'm just going to start and give a very brief kind of introduction of sort of like how we got here and sort of what our hopes are with MISHA and what we want to plan in the longer term. And then Stephanie is going to lead us down a bunch of examples of some cool things that we've been able to do thanks to having the MISHA.
Before you start there, can people see the slides okay? Is that?
We're only seeing that first title slide, so unless you advance. We're seeing the toolbar along the left, and that's fine with us, but go for it.
Okay, perfect. All right, we're good to go.
Great. Okay, can we move to slide 2?
Okay. Oops, there.
Perfect. So we sort of took a funny long path to get to the MISHA, but I've been a part of several projects funded through the Mellon Foundation as a part of the Old Books New Science Lab at the University of Toronto under Alex Gillespie. And sort of aspects of those projects sort of led us towards this sort of space as the years kind of went on. We had a 2-year project with the book in the Silk Roads, which ended in 2020, followed by a current project that's ongoing called Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book. As we were doing, carrying out research in these projects, we started getting more and more interested in the different ways in which we could learn about the materials here and elsewhere that we were studying using various different scientific techniques. So much so that once we started the Hidden Stories project, we have sort of 9 research areas, and we dedicated a research area to what we were calling book science broadly in particular. So whether it's sort of advanced imaging, biocode ecology, X-ray fluorescence, sort of all these different avenues which we wish to take to sort of, we're interested in order to learn more about the objects that we have in our collections. So we sort of started here and sort of in 2024 is when we went and visited Rochester, and we were shown the machine and we learned a lot about it, and we ended up actually borrowing one and then eventually made the decision that yes, we wanted to get one. So can you change to the next slide, Stephanie? Yeah. So what this led to essentially was I didn't, but Stephanie and Jessica Lockhart sent out a call to people that we knew here and at different libraries at the university. We have over 40 libraries at the university and various special collections that are scattered. The Fisher has the largest, but we have lots actually on campus. Trying to reach out and say, does anyone have anything that would be we could use the MISHA for? So you see any potential of anything in your collections that you would like to bring over? So we sort of had these use cases already lined up for using the MISHA once we had it here. And once we sort of were using it, we were really excited about its capabilities, sort of the things that we were able to use it for. We have a donor to the library named Mark Andrews. He's an engineer by trade. He's a books scholar in his own right. He's very knowledgeable about early printed books and manuscripts, and he generously donated money in order for us to get the machine, as well as hire personnel and set up a hub at the library called the Hub for Book Science and Hidden Stories. So this is located in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. That's where our MISHA is seated, but we think of it as sort of a tool for the entire university. So our hope is to truly be a hub, and we're starting with sort of multispectral imaging, but we've already started moving into other avenues such as XRF and FORS and other ways of analyzing the materials that we have here. And you'll see from some of the examples that Stephanie will give that it's not just Fisher materials, it's some of the libraries that are also on campus that have rare materials that we sort of have been in contact with, and we're using the machine to sort of help them as well and learn about the collections at large at the university. So that's kind of all I wanted to say, and just to give a sort of brief little introduction of that, and just as MISHA being sort of the first pillar of this sort of hub that we were building at the university. And I'll pass it off to Steph.
Great, thanks so much, Rachel. So as you heard, since acquiring our MISHA, we've undertaken extensive imaging on a very broad range of items from different areas of the world and different eras. And due to time, of course, I'm going to cover just 4. Well, really, sort of 2.5, because 2 of them go together. So the first cases I'm going to introduce, they arise from a provenance-focused project on a collection of Jewish books held here at the Fisher, the Price Collection. And the first of these that you see here, this is Price F00515, it's a 1716 printed edition of Pinhas's Sefer Halacha. And beyond the original donor to the Fisher, there wasn't much provenance information available for this codex, even though it is absolutely bursting with these ownership inscriptions all over the place. So the collection curator, Nadav Sharon, asked us for assistance in deciphering them. And to his and our delight, they responded very well to MISHA, and we were able to assist in deciphering all but one of the inscriptions. Now, the second example here, this is Price F213. It's a printed edition of Ergas and Livorno's Sefer Dev Yosef, and it bears, as you can see, an inconveniently situated paste down right on the title page. So what was being covered here? we weren't sure whether MISHA would actually be of use, but we figured we were imaging everything at the outset, random pieces of paper, hair elastics, leaves we picked up off the ground, right? We were like toddlers with our new toy. So we said, you know what, let's do it and see what happens, right? And lo and behold, the MISHA can see through at least some paste downs. Now, mainly this paste down covers publication information. The book was printed in Livorno by Abraham Meldola in 1741, but it also covered a censor stamp. And indeed, we suspect this may have been why the paste down was applied. It turns out that the same stamp appears in the other price codex we just looked at, F515, pointing to a shared trajectory for at least part of their history. Now, I've been deliberately a bit vague in discussing these 2 examples because further work on what we've uncovered here is currently underway, but it's being published and not by me, and I don't want to step on someone's toes for that. The next case also comes from Fisher Collections, and it is Friedberg manuscript 3012. This is a manuscript of legal commentaries, responses to the Talmud, to be specific, by one Meir ben Baruch, who was a 13th century German rabbi and poet. And it's in a Sephardic hand, so Spanish or Portuguese, and dates from the 1400s. Now, as you can see, at some juncture in the past, this manuscript was quite badly water damaged, and then mold set in, and this made it exceptionally challenging to read, which was not ideal because this is a very important, unique witness of this particular text. And a range of scholars, have tried to work with it and made some headway, but, not really cracking the case. And a range of conventional imaging methodologies have been attempted in hopes of resurrecting this particular witness, but they hadn't borne much fruit. So Fisher came to us and said, can you assist us with textual recovery? And we tried the MISHA, and as you can see, it responded beautifully. We've made the text considerably more legible, and the codex, I'm pleased to announce, is now being imaged with MISHA in its entirety, cover to cover, so we can restore this important witness to scholars at the Fisher, but also abroad. My understanding is it's going to be hosted online. So my final example here This is from elsewhere in the University of Toronto system, the Robertson Davies Library at Massey College in the University of Toronto. And this is Reuter FF0012, part 1. This fragment belongs to a collection of 5 fragments, which, along with other manuscript binding waste and a variety of medieval Western European manuscript leaves, came to Massey College in February 2017 through the donation of Will Reuter, who is a former graphic designer for University of Toronto Press and the founder of the Canadian private press, Alaquando Press. Now, Will, we knew, inherited this fragment from his great-uncle, Wilhelm Reuter, who was a leading Dutch artist of the early 20th century, and he lived in Amsterdam. Wilhelm likely acquired it via friends, in bookbinding, or via his daughter, who was a trained bookbinder. Because as you can see, this is clearly binding waste, and I wish we had time to look a little more closely at other pictures of it. There's glue all over the back. It's in quite a state. So we did have some provenance details for this scrap. That wasn't the focus in this case. However, it's so challenging to read with faded ink, effaced ink. Some is, lifted right off, whereas the glue is soaked through. It's caused discoloration. And so Massey librarians weren't clear on precisely what it was. We knew where it came from, but what exactly is it? What does it say? That said, in 2020, the previous Massey librarian, Julia King, who's now a librarian at Lambeth Palace, tentatively identified it as a medieval French royal charter. So in hopes of further advancing knowledge of this fragment, the current Massey librarian, Chana Algarvio, brought it to our attention. And the MISHA results weren't perfect. The condition is very, very poor, but we were able to resurrect sufficient detail, both of the text and of the folding pattern, to determine that this is a letter patent. It was issued on behalf of France's King Louis XI, who reigned from 1461 to 1483. This is Louis the Absolute Spider, as he was called due to his reputation for nefarious plotting, right? So the fragment's origin is indeed medieval France, but it's not a royal charter. It's a formal response to a petition issued on behalf of one Jehan de Ponchier, and the original plea would have been directed to the Master of Requests, the principal probationary clerk within the French institutional framework. The resurrected details here specifically link this fragment to the regional parliament of Toulouse. Now, work on that case is sort of ongoing. We're just finishing up. I and Seb Sobecki, who was absolutely invaluable in helping tease out a lot of the details here, have been writing that up. And more information to come along. But this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of things we're doing right now with the MISHA. There are other cases I wish I could have gone into. We've been working, different kinds of setups to work to rake the MISHA for blind printing and things like this, and making a little bit of progress. But for now, I guess, thank you very much for your attention. I think we were under time there, were we? I was aiming to be under time.
You did great. Fantastic. It's 1:28. We've got a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions, or if you put something in the chat, feel free to voice that question. Rich House is up next, but we have time for a question if anybody would like to ask one.
Stephanie, are you still doing most of the imaging in your
sensory deprivation
in your little room in the Fisher, or are you moving it around?
No, well, we were looking at moving it around, and actually, my alma mater on the West Coast, I was telling them about this work, and they're quite excited. We're trying to arrange for next year a visit for me to go out and train some of their students, and also image some of the stuff in their special collections. University of Victoria has a decent collection of medieval manuscripts, and there's some examples there that would probably respond really favorably. The Fisher very generously cleared out one of the study carrels in the basement for us, in the rare books area for us, and blacked it out. They did an excellent job, and they affectionately refer to it as the sensory deprivation carrel, and that's where we do our MISHA-ing, but we're hoping to move it around more. As for I have been doing a lot of it, but over the last semester and a bit, we've trained a whole bunch of students. I'm not sure how many Rachel would know. I can't remember. 10. We trained 10 students, and now I'm currently training Fisher Rare Book staff in how to use the MISHA, so we can get other people on there who will be able to undertake these kinds of projects, and in particular to get that large Hebrew codex entirely imaged and apt for scholars.
That's fantastic.
That's awesome.
Congrats, team. Way to go.
Before Rich starts, Roger found a picture of the watermark.
So I'm almost certain that's the same watermark.
Not showing. Not showing it.
It's not showing?
Now we got it.
Yeah, go for it, Roger.
Okay, well, I'm not much more to say. I think this is the watermark on the 1776 Dunlop broadside, printed copy of the Declaration, and that we imaged at the Library of Congress in 2010. And there is the watermark that we got from that. If you look way over to the right, and hopefully I can figure out how to do that, you can perhaps see, well, it's just off the edge of the screen. You can see where it says United States of America. So there's the printed copy, and we imaged it in 2 sections, and there's the watermark. So I'm almost certain that's the same one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Roger. So Madrona, Paula, Anna, if you're around, we can circulate that image to you from Roger to make sure you get it so that we can maybe do some comparison. But that's really exciting.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That's amazing. Thank you, Roger.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rich House. I work as a senior photographer at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. And last July, I was able to participate in the MISHA Summer Seminar at the RIT campus in Rochester, as did Bob Hickson from the Yale Center of British Art, who presented earlier. And after that, we did get ourselves into the queue to see if we could borrow the MISHA on our campus. And so our institutions are actually across the street from each other. So we just partnered together to share it, and we split the time between the two. And so when I received the setup, I had the experience of the workshop, but I did want to see what I could do about modifying a little bit outside of the framework. And we wound up actually putting the LED panels on some grip heads on light stands, and just mounted the Blackfly camera onto a studio stand, just mimicking very close to the dimensions that it would be if it were all on the framework, but just sort of freeing up a little bit of flexibility if we wanted to change things up. And that's studio that we work in, we have complete control of the lighting, so I could just darken it down and overpower anything. And so, similar as other people have said, the first thing knowing that it was coming was to ask our conservators if there was anything that they wanted to see that they thought might be good candidates. There were a couple of panel paintings that we tried to do some work with. And then there was this one particular piece that I'm going to concentrate on here, which is an Indian watercolor on paper. And it was treated by our paper conservator, who indicated that she believed there was some text in here somewhere that she wanted to know how much we could pull out of it. And so my first step was to go ahead and use the MISHA setup as is, as I configured it, and ran the 16 shots of the different wavelengths. But one of the issues that I have after doing all of that is, if you look at this preview here, you'll see on the left and the right is the capture sequence, and then the lens cast calibration, or the flat fielding sequence. And when you're setting up in the MISHA software, you only have 4 choices of exposures, and I found that to be a little bit limiting, especially if I got to a situation where I wanted to actually back the panels away a little bit further and have a little more control over the actual exposures. And then the next thing that sort of is a little bit of a concern for us is, the lens and the monochromatic sensor that we were working with that kit does fall out of focus in the UV wavelengths. And so, as part of our normal workflow, we often do multi-band imaging, not truly multispectral, but into the infrared and ultraviolet wavelengths with the DSLR that we have modified for full spectrum. And so that's where I went with this next. I kept the LED panels, and I just switched out the camera. And somewhere in the mix, after our workshop, there was a Google group that I got invited to, and I was looking through old conversations and saw somebody trying to troubleshoot their panel, and I realized that RIT had a software that I was able to find that controls the LED panel individually. separate from the capture software. So I didn't have an SDK for the camera with the software, but I was able to just shoot this with our normal workflow. And so, yeah, so for our normal workflow, this is not done with the MISHA. This is similar to what Bob was doing, which is just taking our normal sets of images that we would normally shoot for conservation. So we have a regular visible light, an ultraviolet fluorescing in the visible. And then the third one over is what we would normally get as a result, just doing false color. And so that's like a typical false color result. You get a little bit of that weird channel swapping. You take the ultraviolet into the blue channel, the blue to the green, and the green becomes red, and then the red channel is just tossed away. But just taking those images, splitting them into the individual channels for each color and importing those as a whole bulky image set. For 2 images, I end up with 6 of individual bands that then I can play with PCA, and you see the result on the right. It's just, you're not identifying anything anyway at this wavelength bands, like it's too, it's not granular enough. But being able to see what things are reacting within the different wavelengths is similarly is such an important, powerful tool. So I can't say enough about just the software on its own without even the whole capture system. Is such a great tool. And so when I went into the configuration this way, I was just tethering the Canon camera with the EOS utility software, which still works at the Windows machines. It doesn't work on Macs anymore currently, but since the software was all running on a Windows machine, I was able to do that pairing pretty easily. And then I could just individually select each of the wavelengths when I wanted it turned on or off. And so I'm capturing color images. This is what the sort of image set looks like when it's the sequence of images, and then the sequence of, I was also doing a lens cast calibration and then just applying that as a correction as part of my workflow. And then converting everything to monochrome and using a Spectralon for exposure guidance. So very similar to what we were doing with the other camera, just switching it out and a few more manual steps that were involved. And so when I did this, I was very optimistic, like, okay, I'm going to do this recto view and look for some revelation of some text. And I did the full 16 band, ran it through different algorithms, and there was just nothing showing up anywhere other than just seeing differences within the pigments of the watercolor itself. But I couldn't make out any text. And I'll just say one thing, which is, I did discover that with the software, when you're building your own set, if you have 16 bands, I noted in the capture software, they add a designation that's like a dash with the nanometer wavelength after each file name. And if I mimic that, then the software actually could build the true color image from those images. Even though it was able to do that, I found it was a little bit off from what I would have from a normal light. And since I was overriding the workflow anyway, I decided to just add in some visible light sources and just take an visible light capture for each of the shots that I was doing also with the other wavelengths. And so the final setup looked like this. I wound up sort of out of order with how I got into this, but I also wound up including a transmitted light. Tom Rieger's on this call, I know, and I know he had started to play with that with a set that he was working with. And it just sort of dawned on me that that would be something to add into the mix. And so this is a little video of the sort of setup. So the outside of the 12 or the 16 bands of the MISHA, I'm just taking, 2 of these tube lights, getting the normal light shots, and then I'll put the artwork on a raised piece of frosted plexiglass so that I can actually slide the LED panel underneath it when I get to that shot. The problem with the LED panel otherwise is that it completely fluoresces in the UV, and it looks really like a striking peach color that's very distracting in the visible light. So I just removed it for those other shots. And then, so that's where the text shows up, is when you start seeing the transmitted light. Now in visible, you can see it a little bit, but where you really can see it is in the transmitted IR. Things really start to separate out. And I'm sharing this presentation after, and I've got sort of the information about the lights that I'm using and sort of the setup I have links on that that'll be included as well. But this is something that conservation purchased. It's this very thin, narrow LED panel, which is just amazing. And it does go a little bit into the near IR. If I put a 850 nanometer cutoff, it would just go black. So it's something underneath 850, but in the 700s, I was getting it. But then where I really didn't expect to see this is when I finally flipped over to the Verso view. I have normal and UV, and then when I got to the 900, well, any of the infrared bands, but especially 940, and then again in the transmitted IR, seeing very clearly again text. There's actually text that I could not see at all with my eye on the back that shows up in the infrared, but it's a little bit less than what you see with the transmitted. And so what I've figured out is that we're actually seeing both sides of the text. I'm just not able to read the front text through the watercolor pigments with any of the bands. But when I'm transmitting it from the back, I can get a full read on what's on the back. And then the challenge was to see if I could tease out a way to extract what I know is the reflected version on the Verso versus what the transmitted is, which is an overlapping of the front and the back. And that's something I just don't know if MISHA is like algorithms in the future, if that's something that could be considered, something that would like extract from a limited data set. Because the other part of that is looking at the MISHA data set for the Verso, there's all this stuff about the adhesives and different things of texture on the back, which suddenly would start to add all this interest in like a principal component analysis of things reacting differently. But they're not really what I'm interested in. I'm interested just in the text and trying to split that apart. So this is just a little bit zoomed in look at that sort of example. And so on the top left, you can see that it's the dual text overlapping through the transmitted. On the bottom left is just the reflected on the Verso. And where I wound up actually having some success was bringing this into Photoshop and playing with layers and manipulating some things about it, inverting one of the layers and doing a little bit of lighten and darken and adjustments that way, where I could actually match the tone of the paper and kind of make that text disappear. So what I have on the right is what's remaining of the text that I can make out from the transmitted, even though I could never get to it from a straight shot. And then the other part of this was when you're in the UV, I just want to make a note that the 365 nanometer is probably the biggest culprit, but the 385 and 395, when you're working with the MISHA monochromatic system, you're not filtering anything out. And so if there's anything that's spilling in, I believe there is some IR spilling in from that wavelength on those LEDs, but you're also getting anything in the visible wavelengths that's fluorescing from the UV. So in this case, on the top left, is the most indicative one where there's a hinge that's attached to the back of this that obviously has optical brighteners in it, and it's fluorescing like crazy. And so in the left, it's just the monochromatic 365 nanometer, no filtering, but you are recording some of the fluorescence. And so I have these other UV lights that are more powerful, and I actually did filter down to block visible and infrared and only capture reflected IR. And you can see in that case, the fluorescence of that optical brightener is completely gone, and you're basically just seeing a true reflected UV. I think this isn't quite so important given the limitations of what the spectral analysis software can tease apart for actual identification. I think it's really great that even if you're getting the fluorescence, that you're just able to pull apart things that are responding differently in each of these different wavelengths. And so, yeah, I'll just leave this in the PowerPoint, which will be shared. So if anybody wants links to what the record of the artwork, as well as some of the lights or filters that were involved. And then just thanks to the Art Gallery and the British Art Center for the collaborations and working together to get this on campus, and everyone at RIT, the MISHA team, and making this happen and making this talk happen. Thank you.
Rich, thank you so much. That was fantastic. It was great to see how you basically made a MISHA, not a MISHA, and then brought it back again.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that you're doing things that we never imagined people would do with this system. But I think, and we've talked to Tom a lot about this. One of the strengths of having this type of system is people can be imaginative with it. It's a framework for starting to do different things, right? And yeah, there's a lot of limitations to the way it's currently set up based on the constraints we placed on ourselves with the original design. But I love the fact that the flexibility has allowed you to do things that that are providing real information to you guys that you couldn't have gotten in other ways. That's awesome. That's just really cool.
I'm Andrew Mancuso. I'm the head of preservation services here.
And I am Zach Fox. I'm the digitization specialist here in preservation services.
Yeah, I don't have any slides prepared, but we're going to share screen for a bit. Okay, so we were kind of patient zero with MISHA, and again, big shout out to Izzy Moyer who helped us put together the story map about our endeavors. So we're just going to run through this kind of quickly and then tell you where we're at right now. Basically, we got our MISHA system and the loaned MISHA system that we were able to use, and it all started in 2018 at that camp, and it was really fun, and a lot of the initial kind of brainstorming happened there. Then we got our MISHA system and we figured out how to put it together quickly, do all these tests in our own lab, run through some materials, and get some cool results. And then we were able to start taking it across Ohio, really, to different institutions. We set up this whole sign-up process, kind of similar to what Toronto was doing. And there's Misha in the back of the car with a skateboard. This is us at Cleveland Institute of Art. So we got, some really fun results from this. Some of the Ege leaves, we were able to figure out what the adjacent page would have been. That was a good one. We also took it to the Cleveland Museum of Art, both the Ingalls Library and in the conservation department. And this one, can kind of unveil some of the watercolor, the under drawings in the watercolor. That was a really nice application. This was at the museum part, but they're protective about their data, so they don't want that out there. Then we went to Columbus at the Ohio State University and did some more, really cool IR band work, and that there was a paste down covering this entire page, and they really wanted to see what was behind it, and we saw what was behind it. Very fun. Then we went to Cincinnati and did more stuff with them. They also made a blog post about it. We imaged some cool stuff here as well. Then we went to Oberlin and had a really fun book history class session with a bunch of students. That was really a pleasure. Then we went to the Cleveland Public Library and imaged some really fun stuff there. If you didn't know, the Cleveland Public Library has what I believe isn't it the largest chess collection?
Yeah, in terms of chess serials.
Chess related things.
Yeah, chess stuff.
So if you're interested in chess, Cleveland Public Library. And this is one of the ones that was really fun. It's a composite manuscript. So there was, so many different kinds of skin and parchment in here, all sorts of palimpsesting going on. And so one of the things that we did as part of this project was create an open science framework page for all of the data that we collected. This was part of the agreement we had with the institutions, in that we would come and do this stuff, showcase the MISHA, get their input, so we could then feed it back to you all at RIT. But we also requested that their data, except for the Museum of Art, be available for people to process and for them to process, because we couldn't process all of it for them on site. So this is a public project that any of the files can be accessed here under files. they're somewhere in here. Oh, this is just from the overview. But if you download these files, we were able to, particularly this one, that composite manuscript, there's stuff happening all over here. If anybody, wants to work with this data, it's open data, you can play with it. But at this point in our MISHA journey, we're going to talk about trying to build our own MISHA.
Yeah, the most frustrating part.
Yeah. So I'll actually stop sharing my screen. Well, first, we've added our own tab to the procurement parts list here, and have started to figure out, like, all right, who can we get as a vendor signed up? How's it going to work? What do we need to order? And how far are we going to take it when it comes to kind of the Tom Reiger's Super MISHA Max, or what we're going to end up doing with it. The idea is really to host a hackathon here at Case Western at ThinkBox, which is the largest open door community makerspace in the country. And, Case is a renowned engineering school, so I believe that the students would have quite a field day trying to figure out how to, upgrade a standard deployed MISHA. But we need to get the parts first. And
Yeah.
So this is kind of where we're at. We have really gotten pretty much all of the vendors except PCBWay.
Yeah, so we've been able to get everyone onboarded except PCBWay. The current, I don't know if anyone else in this chat has encountered procurement issues with PCBWay as of 2026, but I've been told by them that they must accept upfront payment. And as a university, we have to do either net 30 or net 45 for accounting purposes. So as far as we know, we can't buy anything from them because we can't meet their terms. So I don't know if anyone else has encountered this. If you guys have had it, also encountered it, then come up with a creative solution on how to navigate that process. But yeah, it's been a thorn in our side, and we're kind of at a loss for words. We don't know what to do next.
I mean, yeah, the first, because this has been going on for about a year. The first round I tried, they had a really hard time understanding our process for onboarding new vendors at the university. There was a form they had to fill out. Didn't really know what a wet signature meant. So that was the first issue. I was also kind of bogged down with a lot of administrative things and bigger projects happening within the library. So until Zach came on board, then I was able to kind of like, hey, let's tag team this. Let's try to figure it out. And we've made some real good progress. We're just now stuck at what I feel like, because we haven't pushed PCBWay on this just yet, but I think that's going to be the next thing we try is like, hey, I mean, once the PO is out, that's as good as gold for us to pay you net 30, minimum. And I feel like they could be flexible, but I don't know. I really don't know.
Hoping they will be.
Couple things. This is great. I'm so glad you were sort of sharing kind of the journey and the experience here. So two things. One, we are looking at a local vendor here in Rochester that would help to have to build the boards and then either hold them in stock or somehow we'd figure out a solution so that they could be purchased much more easily here in the US. That's point number one. So we do have that in the works. We do know friends at University of Kentucky, and I can put you in contact with them, did find a local vendor in Lexington who was willing to make one set for them just as a trial kind of situation. So there's that. But more germane to our group is I'll be sending out a survey to everyone on this call and the Google group. It's a non-committal survey, but it's just to get a lay of the land that asks if people would be interested in purchasing if purchasing were made available in the United States. The reason for that is, so like, for example, if when I send it to you guys, Zach and Andrew, just say, yes, you would be interested in buying. It's not going to commit you. It's just giving us a sense of, for $1,500, are people willing and able to buy from a US vendor to get their own MISHA boards? Because it gives us a sense of what the need actually is, because we hear that people are interested, but when the rubber hits the road, I need to be able to turn around to somebody and say, yeah, there's actually a community of about 50 institutions who would be interested. Again, non-committal, but just trying to like sort that out, because doing it locally, i.e. in the US, will make it far easier than some of the struggles with PCBWay. The fourth thing was they do require a minimum. I was just on the Zoom this morning with folks at Princeton. They require a minimum of 5 to order. That's 5 discrete boards, so 5. And I always encourage people to do assembly as part of that, because you don't want to be hand soldering everything yourself. If you could do that, then, you know, fine, then go ahead and do it without the assembly. But within the MISHA group, there are other people, and we're trying to connect. I feel like matchmaker, like dating game, but there are people who have extra boards or want to go in halvesies with other people, or one institution can purchase from China, the other one can't. So how do they get money from institution A to institution B so that institution B can buy all 5 and then not be stuck with extra boards? So we are trying to, it may not seem like we're trying to work on it, but we are trying to work on it. But the most important thing to take from that is I'll send out a survey and just get a lay of the land of like who's interested.
Yeah, because we've had the same problems with PCBWay, right? I mean, the last set of boards we ordered last June. We only very recently got them. And it was a nightmare for our purchasing people. Absolutely, right? Yeah. So the other side of that survey is if we can go to this local company in Rochester and say, we think that you could sell 20 sets of these things a year or whatever, based on our survey, would you be willing at least to keep the mold or whatever the design, right? There's an upfront cost that we're willing to pay for them to set up their construction process. Right. And to answer the previous questions, yes, I think that would include the LEDs soldered in, so they would already be assembled.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, but we need to go to them and convince them that it's worth it for them in time and money to actually be set up to do this. We know that this is, on the grand scheme of things, a relatively small community. I mean, it's super exciting that we've had 30 people online for the last 20 years, but you know, some companies probably not going to build a new business line for that, right? But we are working on that, and so, you know, please respond to that survey. Even if you're a sort of hard maybe that you think you might potentially want to do this, we are trying to come up with a way to get over that hurdle, because we know it is a big hurdle for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. I felt like you all will be working on a solution, and yeah, I mean, we were poised to order 5, you know, because we were going to build one standard MISHA that would have been used for the hackathon, and then we were going to build our own in-house sort of, you know, lab MISHA that would be closer to Tom's, with a lot more capability, and, you know, see what the students could do with the original one and its original form factor and everything, and then that one could end up, you know, being loaned out to local institutions or something like that. But yeah, I mean, I figured y'all were working on something, because man, I was like, there's just no way that RIT is ordering these, you know, payments same day. And
Nope, we had the same issue. We had exactly the same issue. For some of those funded projects we have where we're building systems for other people,
like the
Iraq project and things like that. That's why we had to order some in it, and it's been a nightmare. And we think, everybody cross your fingers and toes, we think we might have a local solution here, at least in North America, that would help. On the other hand, our colleagues at Kentucky, they found somebody local to them that was able to do it. So, you know, if you want help, I mean, we can give you the bill of materials and things like that. If there are local companies, we're happy to help you guys have that conversation with other people. And I don't think any of the Kentucky folks are on here, but we can connect you with them as well to figure out how they did it, or who did they work with, right? We may already have a vendor in North America based in Lexington we just don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, the you know, specific BOM would be great. I think even again, because we were talking about possible, you know, pathways this morning, and it's like, well, at the, you know, last resort is we cozy up with some engineering faculty and they're like, hey, you want to add this to your curriculum? Like, because there are definitely, you know, people who would be interested in that on campus, but that also takes work. So
yeah.
Thanks, though. That's valuable insight. We know that's a big hurdle. So we're trying to figure out a way to get people over it. So
Amazing. Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
And thanks again for Worldwide Misha Day.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you, and our team want to thank you, RIT MISHA team, because we have this opportunity, unique opportunity to show some of our work. So I will explain a brief context of why NLC wanted to work with MISHA. And after that, I will share a brief presentation of how we are working in the last year. NLC has over 3 million of documents, 3 million of documents, and the responsibility to help local heritage preservation. So what we learn with MISHA will be used to do that in a better way. NLC has have at most 100,000 objects that are the oldest manuscripts and printed text, and a lot of them has damages or censorships that limits the access to other written and physical historical information, like watermarks. And a lot of the oldest books has parts made with parchment and printed paper taken from discharged books. So some of them are fragments erased or hiding behind covers and emblems. And scholars today wanted to know about it because they may have a potential historical value. At the same time, the conservation and restoration field requires exhaustive comprehension and documentation before any restoration in order to preserve unique historical evidence. So MSI help us to do that, limiting or avoiding unnecessary treatments. MSI also provides the opportunity to get images of aspects of past restorations, like in graphic artworks. And as you will see later with my colleague Fred's presentation. MISHA also help us to prevent alteration over invisible information, preserving it for future physical studies. So that's why today MISHA is helping us to improve NLC conservation and restoration processes. So we integrate MISHA into diagnostics to know better our heritage. In restorations, as I said, limiting them or avoiding it, and providing at the same time information without touching the surfaces, accelerating the access to particular information, but so we can publish it and allowing us to make digital restorations in the future and virtualization of those objects. And that results are shared as well to promote the appreciation of our heritage due to this kind of science. Now I will present a few MISHA images I got last year. This is a parchment board of an incunabula book printed in 1496. And scholars wanted to know if we could have an MSI of the erased text. But the images I got reveals in infrared bands that what we are seeing are the text of the boards made with printed paper. So let me see. Okay, here. So Professor Metzlinger explains us that infrared wavelength passes through the thin parchment. So this is an example of unexpected result for us. I think maybe Richard House in his presentations talks about this opportunity to see through materials. In restoration processes, as I said before, MISHA, for example, has helped us to recover and gave access to historical information without restoring physically the books. And this is an important issue because we could use our limited resources in other massive actions over collections. As you know, conservation and restorations are expensive and takes a lot of time. So working with MISHA, we could give access to particular information in less time. In the other hand, some other results drive us to another kind of challenges, like here where we must have to do digital reconstruction to integrate the different results to complete in a new whole image the text that we partially recovered with MISHA. And we don't know how to do this. All this effort is now being published in our institutional digital repository, specifically in our virtual Gallery of Colombia book bindings. This is the first in the country and in the region. And here we provide not also information of particular cases, but the MISHA images too, giving additional information, historical context to scholars and to people interested in historical books as historical objects. So we share MSI to anyone who wanted to see it and downloaded them from free. And we also share MISHA by our NLC social media. And what we notice is that we are getting people into it because now we have a chemist colleague who has already 2 students, university students, working with MISHA to do their thesis about composition of inks. And we have also a philologist interested on the MISHA images, some of the our results in manuscript fragments that I'm working on to use them to his class for his students' research. Past year, we talked about our workflow. So to work with MISHA, we simplify our planning and our how to do it. And we discuss about the results to understand and improve our skills on it. So we are still in the learning process to have a better comprehension of MISHA other possibilities. So later we could share that to librarians of our public network. And so they could analyze if MISHA could help them to solve their specific and problematic access to critical heritage information. This is our main research topics. The first one is the identification of multispectral image signature of ancient inks using censored and corrected text. The second one is to recover images of those manuscript fragments found in printed books because they may form from medieval times. I hope I could talk about it in the next International Congress of Medieval Studies in the Michigan University. And we are also working on the information recording of artistic book bindings because this is a physical information that is complementary to the study of ancient text. And finally, we use MISHA for diagnostics of particular cases, like the work that our colleagues Augusto and Andrea are doing with thermal paper, and that is erased, and it has data of obsolete audiovisual recordings made in Colombia. So they are recording text and detecting differences on these papers, for example. And during the evaluation of how we work, we began using tools for audiovisuals conservation and some fixation strategies and techniques used for exhibitions to fix fragile boards of the book bindings and to get a better capturing processes, for example, as you see in these images. And doing that, we also considered important to make exhaustive documentation. So we measure the distance between the objects, the panels, and the camera to compare the results to see if they produce different images and which are the better. So because we are just doing that recently, we think that it matters, and we are still working on that. And that's why we discuss a lot about what is a successful result in terms of the understanding of what we learn and and which opportunities do we get using MISHA instead of if we got the results expected or not. Here are some results of the work with the MISHA on artistic book bindings. I've got interesting results to allows us to understand decoration techniques that aren't studied yet. So those images are complementary information for this scholar topic research in the country, but we hope that it could be useful too for researchers in Mexico and Spain, because both countries are working on it, and we hope it could be useful to other humanities scholars like ecologists and paleographers. We have also a lot of difficulties and challenges to solve some issues due to the condition of our heritage. We found also the limits of the MISHA, and I'm now into the segmentation of the surface during the capturing and the processing, because of the deformities of the shine of the materials. And this is an issue because it's a frequently aspect in the parchment covers, as you see here in those images. So this creates an opportunity to produce a protocol and strategies to do it, and to reassemble later the images digitally, in order to have a readable image in a whole surface. This is surely something that maybe some of you have already solved, and for us would be very helpful to receive your advices and suggestions on that. And I wanted to finish my presentation leaving you some conclusions while we receive your questions, your thoughts, your advices, and suggestions. Thank you. After that, my colleague Frederick will show his work, specifically in artwork that he is doing with MISHA. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to talking about the multispectral imaging in works of art in the National Library. We have many works of art with different techniques and materials, like, for example, graphite, charcoal, watercolor, oil. So we try to understand the behavior of these materials under the multispectral imaging. So we are going to talk about more about that. As a background, we take into account, for example, the Spolvereo technique, which was detected in the Mona Lisa in the Louvre Museum, the multispectral analysis of works of art in the Prada Museum also, and identification of pigments by multispectral imaging by some independent researchers. So we made a test with various pigments on a sheet of Kimberly paper. These pigments included graphite, charcoal, sepia, sanguine, white pastel, pink pastel, black pen ink, and blue stamp ink. And we try to see how these materials behave directly in works of art. As you see, for example, the image below, the pastels and the ink completely disappeared under the infrared light. This is an example of graphite. This is a drawing from a famous artist of the 19th century, Alberto Urdaneta, and the graphite used layered and metallic structure produce a metallic shine by reflecting light intensely. Ultraviolet light, for example, under this ultraviolet light, the watermark become very evident. And for example, you see the grain of the paper and the state of preservation. For example, the adhesive marks in the paper, and under the infrared light, you see a high brightness and the first strokes of the drawing. This is other example from the same artist. This is a charcoal drawing. Charcoal appears matte, opaque, and dark, and it absorbs light without reflecting it. Under the ultraviolet light, this is PCA analysis under the ultraviolet lights. The charcoal remains opaque, and the irregularly grained magenta support and indicates that it's handmade. And the condition shows light green dirt on the edges and missing support, torn joints, and traces of interventions with the same materials as the mounting hinges on the upper edge. This is other example. This is a drawing from the 20th century from the Carranza font, graphic font in the National Library. This is made with Chinese ink, and this ink absorbs light in the visible and the near infrared spectrum, reflecting only weak energy. The components of the ink, such as soot, absorb wide range of wavelengths. But when it's bound with, for example, Arabic gum, shellac, or charcoal, they scatter light in a particular way, even in water. Therefore, they differ from the black substances such as paints or charcoal under various lighting conditions by forming halos of soot and binder particles. This is other example. This is a watercolor from the 19th century, approximately 1853. And this is from an artist from the choreographic commission here in Colombia. His name was Manuel Maria Paz. And this watercolor, composed of fine pigments, appears transparent to varying degrees due to the diverse light absorption and composition of each color, which determines its reflectance. The main components analyzes in infrared light bands. Could you see the overlapping layers of watercolor pigments which are visible? First layer is violet, the second is magenta, and the support you see yellow. The protective layer casts a faint green shadow over the watercolor paint. This is other example from the same artist. This is a pastel. The pastel composed a fine powder pigment is observed as a fine surface dots with the spectral reflection varying according to the binder and the color of the pigments. Under the principal components analysis in the ultraviolet bands, you could see these three components: the yellow ochre for the support, magenta for the blue pastel, and vermilion for the branches. This is other example. This is all on canvas from Jose Maria Espinosa. This is maybe from 1825 approximately. This oil diluted in turpentine reduces the opacity and density of the pigment, and in spectral images it appears translucent and transparent, unlike a pure or pastry oil paint, which produce less reflectance. In the 940 nanometers infrared band, the initial outlines of the portrait are observed, and the undefined coloring traces. This is our very interesting examples. As a conclusions, we can say that the amount of data collected with each material is observed, whether the support such as its manufacture or the techniques manifested in the work, its materials and the state of concentration, which is found under the multispectral analysis. Knowing that each pigment behaves differently depending on its application of mixture, it can be concluded that it is important to study each of the materials that make a work of art in order to obtain a deep and real understanding of its components and to be able to decide the type of intervention that is most appropriate in each case. As a complement, I can say that at this moment, two students of the local university are working with MISHA in the National Library, trying to study several pigments, trying with our chemist to try to understand for their thesis how these materials behave under the multispectral image and different light bands. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Friedrich. Thank you so much. So questions for Friedrich and Maria Helena. I'll open the floor for questions. Or comments.
So there's been a bunch of things in the chat about Maria Helena's glare issue, and we've seen the same thing, and so have a bunch of people. We're actually working on, and we'll make these plans available to everybody, 3D printed essentially covers that will go over the LED panels into which you could easily place diffusion paper, right? Something that is easily acquired. So that would cut down on the glare if you've got really shiny things. Yeah. Andrew had the idea of using cross polarization, which I think would also be interesting. And we actually have a student who's working a project now to use both standard RGB and MISHA and polarimetric imaging to study silver mirroring on essentially historical photographs to characterize the degree of mirroring, right? But what that means for this is that we might have the capability to have polarization. So we'll have polarization filters for both the lights and the camera. That we might actually be able to try that, you know, come this summer or this fall. That would be an interesting project for one of our students to sort of take on.
Yeah, I agree. And Tom just put a comment about lowering the angle. The light angle helps reduce the glare. Maria Helena and Friedrich and team from National Library, when you got your system, we didn't have the functionality that we now have, which friends who visited in July saw, where we can actually change the angle on the LED where they actually are. So we can chat more about that, but that might be an option to help you in terms of changing the angle of the LEDs so that it's not at the 0.45. If I don't know if
great. Yeah, we try to maybe move the object between or different distances to see if we can avoid that, but it's tricky. It's very difficult. Yeah. So that's why I thought that maybe I should make some segmentation to segment the surface and take a lot of shots, but that becomes later a big problem to reassemble that. It's easier.
If I could just also mention, like the way that I had done the approach in our studio, if you can control the lighting, you could just put those on light stands and put them at whatever angle you want as a potential option.
Yeah,
thank you.
I can't get there right now, but the system all the way in the back, Tom Rieger helped design, and it's basically a bunch of the same stands that we use, but with some 3D printed parts where the arms are now able to move like this, and the lights can go up and down, and they can rotate, so you have sort of 3 degrees of freedom to adjust your illumination angle. And Tom generously gave us the plans for that as well. So, you know, with none of the stuff is complicated to print in a 3D printer. We can talk about that offline as well. This idea of having more flexibility in the lighting conditions. I think that for some certain things like that really glossy thing, that's super important. Yeah.
Great. I think Charles, you is telling me about maybe a filter, a lens filters.
Yeah.
Hi.
So
Charles.
hi, Mary. Yeah, I'm sick today. Sorry. Just finished our group
Sorry.
meeting. So, what did I said that is, for me, I just want to grab the reflective band and the Flamma FLU. I don't know how to pronounce. Like from the UV band, I want to make them apart, and then it help us determine what exactly happened when we see something in the meter system. And also I have a question for you. You said you use a lot of MISHA stuff for the conservation, education, and the workflow, but you said it's hard. So
Yeah.
you means it's hard for conservation student, not imaging science student, to understand and use the MISHA software for analyze like PCA, MNF. They don't know what's the relationship related to this and that.
Yeah. And we are just getting into into a better comprehension on how to solve specific problems, and so we could explain that in an easy way, because for the students of other disciplines, it's not easy to feel comfortable using this technology until they know more about it. So we are just into that. It's tricky even for us to understand and to solve some things.
But it's super exciting. You've started to train other people, right?
Yeah. especially Augusto, because making that promotion of what we are doing with the MISHA, people ask, we want to know more, and we want to do that and the other stuff. So yeah, today is a work that Augusto and Andrea is doing with other people. Yeah.
That's what happens when you get good results. People want more.
Alexandra's up next, but I just wanted to add one thought or one comment to our friends at National Library. One of the things I really appreciate is you always bring a new dimension to our work. Last year it was the workflow. This year for me, many things that you shared, but one is the decision making. Maria, you touched on it when you said that you could MISHA something and reveal the results, and that helps with your decision making not to conserve that item. You actually don't have to conserve that item. You can use the resources for something else. And I think that's a brilliant way to phrase it. That is probably what some other people are doing as well, but they haven't articulated it exactly that way. So thank you for recognizing that MISHA does help actually with you effectively using your resources as an institution. And I think that's really something that people do, but they don't actually articulate it. So thank you very much, friends. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Augusto, who we see there. Thank you, Friedrich. And I think we saw Andrea there as well for a minute. But we'll turn things now over to Alexandra, who presents to us from Toronto, and then we'll have Jenny, and then we'll have a break.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Attia. I recently finished a PhD at the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, and I'm now doing a postdoc where I'm jointly working on a few different projects that deal with book science and archival materials. So I'm working on the Records of Early English Drama project, the Old Books New Science Lab, and the Hidden Stories project, all of which are also based at the University of Toronto. Previously in 2024 to 2025, I was a research assistant for the Andrews Project test run of the MISHA system. which took place at the University of Toronto's Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. The Andrews Project is a project that Rachel DeCresh and Stephanie Leahy talked about earlier. And I want to clarify at the outset that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Andrews Project as a whole. The presentation by Rachel and Stephanie, they're much better qualified to kind of give you the perspective on the project more broadly. Instead, what I want to talk to you about today is a kind of side story that I've been fascinated with that came out of this project, or the pilot version of the project, and that I think can in a way kind of be a case study for using MISHA to try to address specific research questions. And this project had to do with a set of 17th century Peruvian books in the Fisher Library's rare book collection that we began to image during this pilot of the MISHA project. And I wanted to share this with you in particular because I think these documents highlight the utility of MISHA when trying to cobble together book histories in cases where really basic things about the origin and construction of books may be unclear. So to take a step back, how did this get started? How did we start looking into these books? As many other people mentioned in their presentations in the sort of first part of the day, when we first got the system set up, we started talking to librarians and asked if they had requests for things that they wanted to look at. They wanted us to image and see if we could find out anything about them. As we were starting out and conducting this pilot project, I, along with Andrew's project postdoctoral fellow Stephanie Leahy, whom you heard from earlier, and another research assistant, Azure Pham, were asked by Rare Books and Special Collections librarian David Fernandez to look at a couple of books whose title pages said that they were printed in Juli, a rural area of Peru in the Andes, in 1612. David at the time noted that there was something unusual about this press, a fact which I also found in a bit of additional research on the topic. So as you can see here, actually on the title page, sort of below, sort of at the end, it says, impreso en la casa de la Compañía de Jesús de Juli. So it's right there on the title page telling you that it was printed here. However, there's been some scholarly debate about whether or not these books were actually printed where the title page says that they were. So Juli is a very remote kind of high altitude area. It's home to indigenous groups, including the Lupaca. And in the early modern period, it was evangelized by Dominican friars up until the friars were expelled from the entire region, at which point the Viceroy of Peru transferred the parishes to the Jesuits. The Jesuits ultimately accepted the parishes of Juli for a finite period as a kind of test run of missionary work in rural areas of Peru. And they began sort of their pastoral work in Juli in 1576. And from the outset, they were really focused on training in the Aymara language. They founded a school, which then became also a center for Jesuits to learn essentially Aymara and became a center for language training. And then about 35 years later, we see a curious thing, which is 4 books pop up with the imprint of the printer Francisco del Canto, and they're all labeled as having been printed at Juli specifically. All of the books are either bilingual or deal with language learning in some form. So there's a dictionary, a catechism, and so on that are bilingual or in Aymara. And yeah, they're all bilingual basically. And so again, as you can see here, the title page mentions and it was in Peru, and yet at the same time, it's unclear whether or not this press ever really existed here. And the uncertainty stems from a couple of different factors. So one, and this is from the John Carter Brown Library exhibit that included a different copy of the same book, says there remains some debate about the 4 books, all from 1612, that bear the imprint of this particular printer, because he was actually in jail for debts for much of 1612. So it seems unlikely he had an active role in printing these texts. So there's the question one of how is it possible that this printer was actually printing these texts? Were they possibly being printed in Lima? And Juli was the sort of place where they might have been used or issued. The other factor is simply the remoteness of the location. This is from a recent book by Zanna van Loon on the production of missionary books in indigenous languages in the early modern period. And she notes that all 4 editions written by this particular author and printed by Del Canto in 1612 all indicate that they were printed in Huli, but it seems very unlikely that someone could have installed a temporary printing press simply for the printing of 4 editions. However, some of the correspondence indicates that that is kind of potentially what happened. So essentially what David was hoping was that we could, with Misha, find some clues about what these books actually were. Some clues about the paper type, the ink, the watermarks, anything that might give us a little bit of a sense of how these books might actually have been constructed, which in turn can answer some of the larger questions about this press itself. And this I can come back to if we have time, but essentially the other part that's difficult to understand about this potential printing press in Huli is that it's sort of out of step with the development of printing presses in Latin America, which tended to start in urban centers. So for some of the issues that David wanted us to look at, or that we were originally kind of looking at, we actually found it difficult, at least in the sort of initial stages with the abilities that we had at the outset, to use Misha to answer some of those questions. So the paper was actually extremely thin, which made it really hard to do any kind of watermark imaging. We found that quite challenging. And we ended up ultimately kind of getting clearer watermark images with transmitted light and potentially and a conventional camera. Although I was obviously very interested to hear some of the earlier talks also talking about light sheets and other ways to get sort of clearer images of watermarks, which we could possibly do going forward. So initially, we sort of set it aside a little bit because there were other projects that we were testing out that had much clearer and more obvious results at first. But then there turned out to be a sort of another wrinkle in the story, which is that due to some confusion, I accidentally called up the wrong book at some point. And I ended up calling up a much later book that was actually listed in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library catalog as a forged first edition from this same press. So I started to also then get interested in a little bit of a different question, which is what can we do with Misha to understand this idea of reprinting or forgery, which is sort of unclear which of the two it is. Because how can we understand the sort of differences in production and book construction between something that's essentially imitating an original first edition and something that is an original first edition? And here, Misha proved to give us a lot more information about certain things, especially since this book is a little bit more composite. It has a lot of paste downs, and Misha allows us to see some of the text that's essentially written on the sides of the paste downs that are not visible. So, for example, this is the title page of this dictionary, and as you can see with a conventional image on the left, you can see that there's kind of a ridge where the paste down is attached on the other side, but you can't see any of the text on it. Whereas with multispectral imaging, you can see the text that's essentially written on that side of the paste down. So in a way, you can kind of double the amount of information you have about the paste downs in the text themselves. And also given, this is another sort of like, this is a different types of imaging that I was looking at to see the text written on these hidden sides of the paste down, basically. And here you can see it also, again, a little more clearly that with a conventional photo, all you can really see is that ridge. And if, combining different types of principal component analysis and different bands, you can bring out different aspects. Parts on the left might be more visible than others, depending on how you're doing it. And also at the same time, actually for this, I found that this had much thicker paper and it was actually very useful for seeing the impression of certain watermarks. So for example, it's not super visible here, but you can see it more clearly than you can with a conventional photo or looking at it with the naked eyes, a little sort of chunk of a watermark here on the right, the shape here. So in essence, this allowed a little bit more insight into the construction of this sort of other side of the history of this printing press, which is the side in which people are essentially potentially reprinting or imitating original texts. So this kind of led to a number of research questions and research directions that I wanted to think about. Sort of developing more skills, I guess. I mean, myself as someone who's doing the imaging, in understanding questions of paper and ink, very interested to hear people talking about pigment analysis today as well. And seeing what those can tell us about how these books might have been constructed in this period, and can that sort of help us answer some questions about the origin of this press or the origin of the books that claim to be printed at this press. I also want us to consider sort of whether or not multispectral imaging can help us understand the nature of a forged edition or a reprint, and help us kind of see potentially each of these objects as part of a larger trajectory of using this impression and using this, the name of this printer. And it's also at a moment where there's particular, there's been a sort of like 2 really big grant projects in the region to aggregate a lot of documentary history and sort of aggregate documents, and organize them. And it's also, the Fisher has recently acquired an actual first edition of the book that I was looking at, that was the forged first edition. So there's also points of comparison there that I think could be really useful future directions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexandra. We have time for a couple questions if anybody has any questions for Alexandra.
Alexander, just so you know that somebody talked earlier, I think it might have been Rich, about using a light sheet with just a normal camera, which it sounds like you did, but you didn't use a thin light sheet. You can get those on Amazon for not much money at all, like 50 or 75 bucks, I think.
We just ordered a couple that will have,
Yeah.
we got a little bit of extra money left over in the budget, so we went crazy on lighting and imaging. So those
There
will
you
be
go.
coming.
Yeah, and sometimes, yeah, just a standard good DSLR on a tripod pointed straight down with a transmissive light sheet, that goes a long, long way.
Yeah, I was very interested in hearing to hear that earlier when we were talking about the light sheets, and I think it can be helpful because some of the watermarks are really like also very much in the corner, that in a way that makes it extra difficult to try to.
Strange location, aren't they? That was one of our biggest hurdles, to the point that we were considering talking to Maya Ballant, the Fisher's in-house conservators, wondering if she would disbind it for us, if we had an excuse for that, because they're in a very strange place, the watermarks. Yeah.
It's also exciting to have you guys go right after the folks from the National Library of Columbia, right? To make that little connection about these sorts of similar printed books, right? Very cool.
All right. So I'm Jenny Lynn. I'm the language program director at Dartmouth College's Department of Classics, which means I am just very much a Latinist. That is really the only skill I am bringing to this. So for a small undergraduate college, Dartmouth has a pretty good collection of manuscripts and early printed texts. And every spring, I teach a very hands-on intermediate Latin course that introduces students to the basics of Latin paleography and working with Latin manuscripts. We meet in Dartmouth's Rauner Special Collections Library, and we work really closely with manuscripts in the Dartmouth collection. The class always culminates in a group project in which students, in groups of 3 or 4, work to find out everything they can about a single fragment in the Rauner collection. They photograph, they transcribe their fragment, they identify the text, they look for other fragments in other collections from the same context, which they persist in calling Finding It Friends. And they publish their work on a shared WordPress site. And beginning this spring, we'll also be adding our fragments to Fragmentarium to make them more discoverable by others outside Dartmouth. So 2 years ago, we concentrated on binding waste, some ex situ, but mostly still in situ waste, bound into manuscript codices and early printed texts in our collection. And then last year, we concentrated on individual leaves in the collection, mostly leaves that were sold by the infamous biblioclast Otto Eggy in the middle of the last century. Dartmouth has a pretty good collection of these, though we don't have fragments of original leaves number 30, which is the one in RIT's collection that turned out to be a palimpsest, but we'll try the other ones. A number of manuscripts that my students and I have worked on have proved to be in part unreadable because they've been erased or damaged. So when I learned about MISHA last summer while I was at Rare Book School, I reached out to the MISHA team asking if I could make a trip out to Rochester to learn more. And I was pretty stunned by how welcoming their response was. Julie set everything up. I drove out to RIT. Dave, Roger, and their student Rain Milligan ran me through the basics, and I brought my own manuscript leaf, and they sent me home with some data to play around with. And I reached out to colleagues at the Dartmouth Libraries and our Hood Museum of Art and our conservation lab, and they were all super excited by the prospect of having a MISHA here. Dartmouth's Leslie Center for the Humanities gave me a faculty research grant to cover the costs. And I am in the very last stages of setting this thing up. I have it all ready except for the LED boards, and I'm hopeful that I might start doing things next week. So I come to you just a girl with big dreams and no data. But I thought I'd show you some of the things that I plan to look at first with the help of my current class this spring. We're like a week and a half into the quarter when I finally get things all set up. So first up, this is more of my own personal project. I've been doodling around with this for a while now. This is Rauner Landsberg 40, and it consists of 3 folios from an 11th century sacramentary. And I'm going to show you the recto and verso of each. All 3 folios were reused as paste downs inside the boards of a later codex and then torn out of there and acquired by the collector Mark Landsberg, Dartmouth 49, who gave them to Dartmouth. Folio 1 is from the Sanctoral portion, and it contains material for several feasts in May. The recto here is super easy to read. I mean, you can just read it. The verso, however, is a different story. This was the glue side of the paste down. And while I can actually see the occasional letter here and there, and have managed to reconstruct actually the entirety of this with some confidence, when the folio was removed from the boards of its host volume, most of the ink remained on the boards of that volume as an offset. As an illustration of this, I offer this image of the inside of the front board of Rauner Incunabulum 57, a 15th century printed volume from which the paste down has been torn out, leaving all its ink behind. And we actually have a few volumes like this that have offsets like this. So back to Rauner Landsberg 40. Folios 2 and 3 are trickier to reconstruct than folio 1. They both come from the part of the sacramentary that contained instructions for priests performing rituals. So here's the recto of folio 2. This is the non-glue side, and though it's stained by the leather covering of the binding, and it has that fold, it was folded to shape that conceals the top line. The prayers, which are written in black ink, are super easy to read. However, the rubrics, which tell the priest not what to say, but what to do, have really faded. As you can see, I'm about to show you a detail of the top left of this folio. And, you know, I can reconstruct the black. I cannot really reconstruct the rubrics. As for folio 2 verso, this is the glue side. It's lost some text, but it, again, really easy to reconstruct from other sources. 3 recto, pretty good. Even the rubrics here are fine. 3 verso, again, the glue side. It left behind some text when it was ripped from the boards, and the rubrics are very faded. Here comes a close-up. In this detail from 3 Verso, you can see that the blind ruling is actually a lot easier to see than the ink that was once there. And the rubrics are really the interesting part of this manuscript. The prayers, they're the same everywhere. The rubrics are where you see like regional variation. All right, so I use Rauner Landsberg 40 in my class, but it's really my own project. I've thought about it so much that like I'm not ready to give it away to my students. But I will finish up with a quick look at a few of the fragments, all of them also pieces of ex situ binding waste in our collection that I plan to assign to my class this spring for their final project. So I actually invited them to this Zoom, so this might be the first look that some of them get at the fragments they'll be using. All of these, I think, and I'm hoping you'll tell me afterwards if I'm wrong about this, but all of these are fragments that I think will be rendered much more readable using MSI. So first off, another Landsberg manuscript. This is Rauner Landsberg 10. It's a maybe 13th century musical text. The writing is the text is pretty good. The music is pretty hard to read. I think this may have been a paste down. Next, my personal favorite. This is Rauner manuscript 2285, and it is an envelope of fragments. These are all pieces of a 15th century manuscript of Sallust, his Bellum Catalinae, that was reused in the binding of a 16th century Plato and then removed. And this one is going to be fun because we have, of course, complete text of the Bellum Catalinae, which means students will be able, I think, to figure out just how these various fragments once fit together and figure out how many folios of the original text we have represented here. Here's Rauner manuscript 2387, a 14th century text that looks to me like it was used as a paste down. And if you look carefully at the lighter side here, there's the ghost of another text just visible there. I don't know if it's not show through. It might be an offset of something that was next to it when it was in situ. Finally, this is Rauner Manuscript Codex 3498. So this is a book. The text block inside is a manuscript on paper. It's a Latin text on penitence, and I find it boring. But more interesting is the waste parchment limp cover that you can see here. The front is on the left, the back is on the right. And this comes from a doctor's recipe book. And the students who worked on this in the spring of 2024 managed to read one of the less damaged sections. We have some recipes for headache, if anyone is interested. But there's a lot more work to do on this one. And anything that we can do to make the damaged text, I mean, it's faded, it's water damaged, part of it's been crossed out. Anything we can do to make that more readable would be helpful. Finally, a project for the more distant future. This is an old project that I thought I was done with, but now I see new possibilities. So just a few years ago, a team of students and I digitized an entire 16th century antiphonor in the Rauner collection and published it all online with a full index and a transcription and even the music, like you can click a button and the music plays. And the book begins with this hymn. And obviously, at some point, the text of the hymn needed to be modified. It's a pretty common hymn. It wasn't too difficult to reconstruct the erased lower text. And I mean, it's super obvious if you look at the initials, especially in that middle image, like look at that P down there in Praecepta. It looks up close, it looks even worse. It looks like they did it with like a child did it with tempera paint. I'd love to add to our site images that make the undertext actually readable. This, however, is a project for the more distant future because this codex is a monster. Here it is in the Rauner Library. It sits out at all times because it weighs more than 100 pounds. And on the left here is an image of some of my students in the basement of the library is digitizing the text. It took 3 students on the text to sort of hold it. There wasn't a cradle big enough for it. So it took 3 students on the text and 2 students working the cameras to get this thing digitized. Anyway, I'm obviously just at the very start of all this. I'm looking forward to seeing what my students and I and my colleagues across the campus can find this spring once we get things up and running. And I'm very much looking forward to the MISHA Summer Seminar, where I hope to become competent.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Jenny. Thanks for sharing. Questions, comments, feedback, thoughts for Jenny? I love that you're a girl with big dreams. I think we feel that vibe. Other things that people want to share?
So Jenny, I don't know if you were here when we talked earlier, but we had a student that was trying to image a very large thing. And she came up with this thing. I don't know if you can see that.
I saw this earlier, and then later on I had to run off and go teach. But
Right,
yes, I saw this, and it slides across. Right?
Yeah, it's a rectangular large base, and then this is a sliding contraption that'll slide back and forth on here, and you can mount the camera and the panels on this arm, right? So these are pretty minor modifications, and then this whole sort of U-shaped structure can slide back and forth along the thing. So if you built a rig that was big enough that the book would sit inside it, right, then this thing can just sort of the whole kit and caboodle just sort of slides back and forth. So I mean, I think that's a cool. If you want to go back to that book, that was pretty straightforward to build. It's just, I think it was less than $100 or so in aluminum. So
I actually added that book to my slideshow after I saw that rig this morning. I was like, oh, wow, I could maybe go back to that big antiphonor, because that thing, it's a monster. It's really big.
Yeah. Oh, I think Julie just put Julie just put a better picture of it in the chat.
So that's the left is Sawyer, the student who's leading that project, and the right is Eli, the grad student in College of Art and Design, imaging the map. So Eli's making notes on the segments and blocking off, and then you can't see it here, but they had a long strip of Mylar that they used to lay over each segment as they moved it along to the next to assure that they had overlap where they needed it. So this long strip of Mylar they were using to gauge like where the camera would be situated. I don't see the piece of Mylar on there, but they were using that to slide across. So
the only thing that one doesn't do is it doesn't go up and down. So they knew what height they wanted to be at, so they sort of set it that way. But again, that would be pretty straightforward, I think, for some clever students to figure out if you needed to move the camera up and down and stuff. But yeah, that would solve that problem.
That's probably better. I just put another image in that's lower, so it gives you a sense of how operationally it works. So obviously don't share those. Those are students, pictures for the students for their portfolio. So please don't share those further, but just helps give you the context to that. So other questions folks have or thoughts? For anyone, so for Maria Helena, for Friedrich, Alexandra, or Jenny. It's fantastic.
Jenny, I think it's really cool that you're having students do this stuff, right? This is just, here you go. Try to figure this out, right? Let's see what we can learn with all the hammers and screwdrivers we can find. That's awesome.
Yeah. I suspect they may be better at it than I am.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here at World Wide MISHA Day in 2026, and let's hope there's many, 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 many more. I'm Peter Herdrich. I'm a Senior Presidential Advisor for Global Partnerships and Cultural Heritage Strategy at the Council on Library and Information Resources, a position I just took recently. And I work on cultural heritage preservation projects, mostly in the field of digital infrastructure building, around the world. I work a lot in the MENA region. I also am the co-founder of the Antiquities Coalition, which is an anti-looting and anti-illicit trafficking organization, and which is well known for that work. That's where I come from. I come from more of a cultural heritage preservation background rather than, I'm not an academic, I'm not a librarian, I'm not an archivist. So I can say, though, that I am a cultural heritage preservation person. And I joined the MISHA team recently to assist with outreach to partners around the world, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. And what I like to do what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about MISHA and its remarkable uses in cultural heritage preservation, at least as I see them, and as I become more familiar with them as I work more with the team here. Okay, so let's start here. We're going to start with a little story, and this starts in 2022. That's me in Algeria. I'm on a research trip there. I had some funding from the US government to work with the Algerian Ministry of Culture to try to figure out a couple of things with them. They wanted to do more on cultural heritage preservation. They were a little uncertain about where they could best put their efforts. And so I joined them, and along with some other partners of mine, to travel to Algeria and to do some research and to find out exactly where we thought resources could be spent, where they should be making an effort, what things were most under threat, that sort of issue. So anyway, here I am. I'm in the desert areas of Algeria. And if you can think of the map of Algeria, what it looks like, and it looks kind of like that. Well, I should do that in the mirror image. I don't know if I can do that. And if you stuck your finger right in the middle of it, which is right in the middle of the Sahara Desert, that is where we are. What we ID'd as the challenges that we thought were most threatening to cultural heritage in Algeria at the time. This is, remember, 2022. It wasn't so much the rise of Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, which of course was a threat and resulted in some damage and some troubles, particularly in the southern area of the country. What we saw, though, there was really two problems. One is, of course, the question of climate change, and particularly, again, in the desert areas in the Sahara. You can imagine the climate has gotten much worse. It's much hotter, and temperatures go up extremely high there in the summer now, higher than they had been before. So that, of course, is a challenge. And the other one, and the place that this is most vivid is in places like this. You'll see this image. This is a khizana is the Arabic word that they use for it. And what that is it's a small private library that exist. These exist across the Algerian Sahara region, but they also exist. You may have heard of Chingiti in Mauritania. There's also these small privately held libraries in Libya, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in much of Western and Northern Africa. And what they do is that they house materials, manuscripts principally, but also all sorts of educational materials that were obtained when people from the area went on the Hajj. So they would travel back to Mecca, and on the way out and on the way back, they would acquire manuscripts, and they would bring them back for their own personal use, but also for the use of people in their communities. And so this was a wonderful process that started about 300 or 400 years ago. So many of these libraries, many of these khizana have been around that long and have done a really, really brilliant job of maintaining and protecting and preserving these cultural resources. But as I say, as with the threats of climate change, we're seeing a bit of a change in that. So let's do this. That is a picture that is taken. We estimate. When I say that, I really credit belongs to the people at the university in Adrar, which is in the center of Algeria. The faculty there do a lot of work on manuscripts, and this is just a scene from one of these khizana of pages that you can see just had deteriorated to the point where they just fell apart. And they attribute much of this to the change in temperatures, and also what people are suspecting is that as our researcher friends go around and visit these things, there's about 100 of these in Algeria, and they regularly try to get to see this material. And when they look at it, they look for signs of damage, but they also look to see how they can help, what they can assist with, and of course they're researchers and they're interested in, of course, in the content. Many of these manuscripts are science and mathematical treatises. There's also religious material as well, reflecting its origin when people went back and made the Hajj. But and you can imagine, at that point, it took about a year to do that trip. So it's a long trip, and people who did that were, of course, had the wherewithal to be able to leave for that amount of time. So they came back with lots of different interesting things, and those are still out there. And they're under threat. And that's the point that I really want to make with this, that they are under threat. All right, so we went to the town of Adrar. That's not Adrar. That is a small village located not far from it. It was about 30 kilometers away. And that on the right is it's the middle building there on the right, is the local Khizana. We went to see that. We went to have a look at one of these, one of the local libraries in situ, and we found that we were joined by our friends from the Ministry of Culture from their library division. On the left there is the head of that, Hassin Menjour, who was with us on this, and that's the librarian on the right. Now, the thing I'd like to point out here is we're out in the desert. There is no question that this is we were there fortunately in March. We weren't there in the summer, but it's very hot. And you can see there, one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting is they keep the windows open. There are no coverings on the windows. And that comes up for two reasons. I'll tell you. The first is, of course, to help control the heat in and out. They keep it very dark. They keep all their manuscripts in cabinets or chests, that sort of thing, to keep them out of harm's way of any kind. And I note this because you'll see the windows open. When we were there, we saw bats fly in and out of that window and fly around in the library space. And I have a slight phobia of bats. I'm not a huge bat fan, and we had some other people who felt the same way. And I thought to myself, is this the greatest idea in the world to have bats in and out of here? And I thought maybe I should. What I thought really was, I thought I should not ask that. That was not a question that I thought would be appropriate for me, a guy who knows very little about this entire subject. I did wait, and I talked to my friend Hassan, my colleague on this, and I said, "Well, what about the bats? Or should we have bats in with manuscripts?" And he said, "No. We love the bats. The bats eat insects, and it's the insects that we think are the biggest threat to our material." And I thought about this a lot because I thought, that really is a lesson. I think for me, as a cultural heritage preservationist, not necessarily as a librarian or a subject matter expert, but that was an important thing for me to learn, that the people like this librarian have maintained these collections for hundreds of years and done it extremely successfully. And the path of knowledge, the research that can happen, can be two ways. I thought that was very important, and I still think that is, and it's an idea we've tried to adopt in all the work that we do in many different areas around the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, so let's move along here. This is a collection we saw too. This is correspondence that occurred. This is 20th century material. It is from the time of the revolution, not the revolution, but the Civil War with the French. And you can see burnt pages. And in retrospect, when thinking about this, and after having learned about MISHA, I thought to myself, okay, so here's a perfect spot for the use of MISHA out here in this very small, very far from anywhere library, which could really reveal very much about arguably the most important event in Algerian history in the 20th century, their civil war with France and eventually their independence. But I hope that, it's that sort of thing that I wanted to make this point as a guy who's interested in cultural preservation. Research was not always the first thing I thought about. I always thought about what we want to do is we want to get pictures. We want to be able to make digital surrogates. We want to be able to have inventories in case something gets looted. We can find it. We can get it returned, repatriated. But one of the things that we have to always remember, and I learned this lesson from my friends at Clear, they deserve credit for this, is to say that we have to remember that research is critical. And so I realize I'm running short on time. Let's just run through a couple of other slides here. I want to introduce Archbishop Najib Mikhail. He is the Chaldean Archbishop of Iraq. He is our latest. I got involved with this project in order to do some outreach in the Middle East, and I have been working with Archbishop Najib for some years. And Julie asked me if I could bring him in as a MISHA user, and we've just created an agreement with him, and the director of his library will be coming to the summer session this year, and you will see her. And I hope if you are there this summer, you'll say hello to her. She's a lovely woman, and she is the director of something called the Center for the Digitization of Eastern Manuscripts, run by the Archbishop here. The Archbishop, I have so many stories I could tell you, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead. This is examples of the type of material he has. This is a Bible from 1000 CE, and it is in 4 languages. It's a book that you take a look at, and you are just left aghast that something like this would be there, and what Misha might reveal with a look at this, we can hope to know soon because of his new partnership with us. Another example of something that he had that I have the photograph. Those pages don't move. That's a block is what that is. And so we can imagine Misha revealing much about that. I wanted to also mention one last thing. This is the Egyptian Heritage Rescue Foundation in Cairo. It is run by the man in the blue shirt on the right is Abdelhamid Salah. He is a longtime partner of mine and a brilliant trainer. He's a senior trainer at ICROM and at UNESCO, particularly focused on emergency response. And the last thing to say today is that we have just created an opportunity for ourselves. It's called CHIME, the CHIME Center. That's Cultural Heritage Imaging in the Middle East. We're going to locate the CHIME Center over here that's called the Beit al-Razaz. That's the name of the building that you see there on the left. And at the Beit al-Razaz, Abdelhamid Salah and his staff here will receive 4 MISHA systems, and they will lend those out. They will serve as a hub. They will also serve as a training center. They will also serve in service to additional technical marvels that Dave and Tom and the rest of the staff up there are coming up with. We're always excited about the idea of using cell phones, and Tom, I'm sure you'll be able to talk about that to do digitization. So let's just see. I think there's Abdelhamid. Oh, and there's the last picture I wanted to end on, the MISHA system. So if anybody has any questions, just anything I can talk about at all, I'd be happy to do that.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you for sharing about the past locations and places and where we see need and opportunities coming together. Just one note, it's Cultural Heritage Imaging Methods and Education instead of Middle East, but it's Cultural Heritage Imaging Methods and Education in Cairo. Peter and I have worked on many, many iterations of that acronym to make it work. So it's, I'll put it in the chat here real quick, but it'll be based in Cairo. So questions for Peter? We have a little bit less than a minute.
I have one.
Yeah.
Peter, that was so awesome. I mean, that very reminiscent, it brought back memories of imaging at St. Catherine's Monastery. Mike Phelps is also on the call, who may have some comments to make, but you were talking about the manuscripts that people brought back. So I'll just add a little bit. We've been working on a manuscript that was from St. Catherine's, made with parchment that apparently went by the monks would buy as the parchment went by. And in that, we have found the only known copy of the star catalog of Hipparchus.
Wow.
And that's what we've been working on that for months. And none can't show you any images yet, but it's going to come out sometime soon. And what you said just reminded me of that. And I don't know if Mike Phelps has anything to add.
Mike, did you want to add anything?
He may be away from the computer. Anyway, it's just awesome. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks. It's very interesting. The whole idea of digitization and documentation has become it's become a subject for diplomacy. And there's something that we talk about sometimes, not digital diplomacy, but digitization diplomacy. The idea is that projects like this are funded often by the American government, but also by the EU and EC funding sources. And what happens is because it's not that expensive. It's not that expensive to put together a digitization lab. That's what I do frequently with my friends at the Egyptian Heritage Rescue Foundation. But what we see, and when we look into the future, just a tiny bit, what we see is the addition of MISHA to all of those. That giving people the opportunity to do multispectral imaging along with their digitization documentation, their white light digitization documentation for inventory and purposes similar to that, is going to be a huge step forward for us. And it closes the circle is what it does. If you think about preservation, and then you think about digitization, and you think about access to that material, and then you think about research, MISHA really does help close that circle and makes it a virtuous circle, really.
Julie, did you mention how we ended up meeting with Peter?
I didn't actually, but it's as a result of our work with the Whiting Foundation on the project in Iraq. So we reached out to Peter to ask him to assist us with coordination. We had the Mosul portion covered. We had contacts there, Dr. Yahya Hadar from RIT Dubai. And Peter has contacts in Kurdistan, specifically Erbil. And so we were able to connect through Whiting Foundation, and I am all the more merrier and grateful. It's been great working with Peter and bringing him into our work here at RIT.
It goes back one step further, because our friend Chet Van Duzer was the person who connected us through folks at the National Library of Columbia to the Whiting Foundation. The Whiting Foundation were the people that first funded our work, getting systems to Friedrich and Maria and all those folks in Columbia. And then the person who's in charge of the Whiting Foundation really, really liked it and wanted to try to expand the network. And so she put us in contact with Peter. And so it's kind of just a growing thing, which is really, really nice.
And let me add too that the Whiting Foundation funded my very first project back in 2015 with CLEAR and with Stanford, which was a digital library of the Middle East. And so we all owe a tip of the hat to Constantia Constantino and the folks at the Whiting Foundation, and before her, Daniel Reed as well, for their generosity and their spirit.
Hi, I'm Helen. I'm at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. I'm in the English department and in data science. So my normal research is in Vercelli, Italy. And my research from the medieval studies aspect of my work. And so here's the MISHA set up in Vercelli. The place in Vercelli is legitimately the medieval bishop's palace. And the current bishop still lives there and cycles his little bike around in the courtyard. It's very cute. And so the wonder of the MISHA can fit entirely into a suitcase. So it's very easy to get there despite cobblestone streets. And here's a little snapshot of imaging the Mappamundi. There's only a handful of Mappamundi from the Middle Ages that survive. And the image on the left-hand side is the image of it under natural light. And then here's two processed images. Because medieval maps are what they are, this is obviously some very elaborately drawn creatures. And then the Alexander the Great praying to the tree of the sun and the moon, which are trees that talk and provide prophecies, and told Alexander the Great that he would die within the year. And so he had to return as quickly as possible to his wife and mother. He was much more upset about his not seeing his mother than his wife. That's a whole issue. But you can see how the very edge of the known world is marked by Alexander the Great. So MISHA has allowed us to be able to see details on this document that would not otherwise be seen. We talked earlier, or one of the participants talked earlier about trying to teach and introduce new people to the MISHA. So in Vercelli in 2024, we ran a digital humanities summer school in which we did introduce students to the MISHA. And it was really, we felt really lucky because we were able to do that in situ in an archive. In 2025, we were supposed to be able to run an NEH summer school in the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, where we would have introduced students to the MISHA again. However, we got doged, so that did not happen. However, I wanted to primarily share, Roger asked me to primarily share the work I had been doing this past spring in Karlsruhe. So I was asked by a medievalist colleague, Dr. Nicole Vollmering, to fly over to Karlsruhe, Germany. She has an Irish grant that is helping look at pre-9th century Irish palimpsests. And because the Irish tried to convert literally everyone, there's a lot of Irish manuscripts on the continent, and there's a lot of palimpsested Irish manuscripts on the continent. While we were there, we weren't able to block out the room at all that we were imaging in. We were just imaging in the middle of their rare books room. However, she had bought this collapsible box that was designed, I think, for influencers to like take pictures of food, but it worked. It kind of pops up and it fits around the MISHA and allowed us to black out this area very effectively. The other unexpected consequence is because the inside was very shiny, I was worried about what that would do to the lighting, but it actually ended up working as a diffuser and ended up causing the light to be more evenly spread across the documents. Here are some examples of some of the results. You can see the document on the left-hand side under natural light. I, looking at that, would not have sworn that that was a palimpsest, but imaging has clearly revealed that it is. And there seems to be two different types of texts under this one medieval Irish codex. One of them is a majuscule Latin, so like big capitals, and the other one is a minuscule. If you are familiar with Latin paleography, the cheat to tell if something is really old is if there are no spaces between the words, because obviously your Latin would be good enough that you didn't need to know that there were spaces there. And this majuscule script seems to be a Latin of that variety. So it appears to be a quite early text. This is another example. Here are several different processed versions of this one text. I really particularly like that you can see a bit of a capital, and you can see that a tiny bit in the natural light image, but after processing, you're able to get back significantly more details and also just see that nice giant capital better. The text seems to vary, the undertext seems to vary throughout the one codex. And so here you can see this particular page both has what looks to me like water damage as well as being palimpsested. And so the MISHA images both manage to recover the text in the damaged area and also allow us to see enough of the palimpsested material. And the palimpsested material, the undertext, is clear enough that even looking at this computer screen, I can read the Latin off of it to you. So this was a very effective use of the MISHA. While I was there, I sort of persuaded Nicole to allow Alex Zawacki, who is a professor of multispectral imaging at Göttingen University, to come and join us. And Alex primarily works with the phase 1 system, and he was blown away by the MISHA. He was very impressed with the ability of the MISHA to get through the amount of documents that we got through. We had 2.5 codices that we were trying to get through in 3 days, which was ambitious. But because once the MISHA is going, you can just keep turning the pages and keep going. We were able to capture all of the data that we wanted to get done. And so here you can see, again, this is more an example of the capital letters underneath the Irish script. Here is a beautiful example of the palimpsest, because you can see where the overtext stops, and then you can see the sheer quantity of undertext, and this is the minuscule that goes across the page. Okay, so I had told Roger that I would talk mostly about the Germany trip, but this last week I went to El Paso. I went to give a talk and some workshops at UTEP, and so I just wanted to show you that UTEP has book brands. Like, they have PAL brands that were specially made for books because Texas. And so those are just fun. While I was there, I led another workshop on the MISHA. Here's me working with students. Obviously, before Roger or Dave, you flinch at me imaging like this. This was just a demonstration of the MISHA, and we weren't actually collecting data. Later on, I purchased my own version of that weird influencer box, and we experimented with this mouse-covered creation. Somebody had donated this book to UTEP's special collections recently, and they have no idea what it is. They have no idea what to do with it. However, with imaging, we were able to see on this, so in the central image, there's the red velvet cover that used to be there, and you can see just kind of the pure remnants of it. But you can see that there is binding fragments underneath the velvet. And so this is the regular MISHA images after processing. And I've been experimenting a lot with Klahi. And this is the same image after it's run through Klahi twice. I used ImageJ for this, but you can see that you can get back enough of the text that if you squint and feel like a headache is fine, you could start to transcribe it. So the MISHA is able to get enough detail back from the front of this cover that, like, okay, I work with a lot of old, gross manuscripts. I like manuscripts that are old and gross. I was trained by people that you don't use gloves on manuscripts. This document was so disgusting that the lady's gloves that she was using turned yellow. And after I touched it, I had to go wash my hands immediately because they were afraid I'd get that weird mouse pee disease. And so it was disgusting. But the MISHA was able to capture enough manuscript detail from the cover, from that one disgusting fragment on the front, that you can actually begin to transcribe it if you're willing to suffer a bit. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Helen. That was exciting to see. And Maria put some comments in the chat about the markings that are also used for cattle and provenance. So you might be interested in that. I think there might have been some questions too. So thank you so much.
Helen, I was just going to say, if you can send us any information about that, the little influencer tent that you bought.
Yeah.
We'll send it out to the MISHA group, so that, because that looks like it's a really good size. And you're totally right. I hadn't even thought about it, but imaging inside a shiny material is effectively going to act like a diffuser, right?
Yeah.
And that is a very happy accident, or I'm sure it's exactly what you were planning for. A well laid out plan, well executed.
Yes. Yes. You know me so well. It is definitely a thing that I intended to do. and had no accidental benefits. This particular version of the influencer tent I'll send you also has a variety of different colors you could have as a background for whatever reason. But the thing that seems interesting to me long term is that it also has a series of LEDs that you can attach to the inside of the tent. I obviously did not do that because I had a functioning Misha, but I think it might provide an interesting option going forward for something. So I will send that to you.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
that'd be great.
So Helen, you should have turned the lights around and reflected directly off the sides. Then you would have really gotten diffused.
Yeah, if you had, there's this thing, a really high-end fancy calibration for optical systems called an integrating sphere, which is basically a very shiny thing that the light all bounces around, and so it effectively comes perfectly diffuse. And that's
it's a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a brilliant thing. We'll definitely buy one and try it out.
Yeah.
So Helen, I did have a couple of quick points. Number
Please.
one, I'm really happy to hear that you were working with Nicole, because I kind of lost track of her. I know she had a project she was working on. I'm really glad you were able to help her out.
Yeah.
And the second thing is I'm very envious you got to go to Karlsruhe, because I wanted to go there, because that's where the guy who pioneered multispectral imaging back in 1910, sorry. The Benedictine monk who became a Nazi. And in the library there, they have his papers, and I've always wanted to go and look at them. So at some point, we'll have to go back.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more manuscripts that I think could benefit from MSI. And so, Roger, I think you can definitely persuade them that you need to go back.
Yeah. Well, great.
So I decided I was asked to kind of talk about my experience with Misha. And so just to give some context, I am an assistant professor at the University of Delaware, and I teach for the Art Conservation Graduate Program, so the Woodpack program at the master's level for early career conservation professionals. So I wanted to talk a bit about how Misha has played a role in training art conservators how to understand multispectral imaging. And so just quick background on myself. I'm an imaging scientist, a conservation scientist, and I run the Imaging Science Lab for Cultural Heritage at UD. And so a lot of the work that I do is centered around developing new workflows or algorithms to visualize imaging data, doing material characterization, doing any sort of spectroscopy-based imaging, and also looking into R&D of portable low-cost systems. So you could see that Misha is really kind of right up that alley to use and explore. So at the University of Delaware, we actually have 3 art conservation programs. So one at the undergraduate level, we're the only one in the US to have that program. And then we're one of a few graduate programs that give a master's degree for art conservation, and that's a joint program with the Winterthur Museum. And then we do a doctorate in preservation studies. And so, you know, part of my role is trying to bring imaging and microscopy and science to these students. And when I arrived 3 years ago, I built a year-long course sequence really focused on imaging and science to teach fundamentals to the young, to early conservators. So, you know, when we look at an object, we try to use different modalities across the electromagnetic spectrum. We use near surface techniques like UV and then visible light, and we start to penetrate using infrared light, maybe X-ray. If anyone's done OCT or terahertz, it's also a nice way to get a virtual cross-section. But the whole goal of what I'm doing with the students is try to teach them the fundamentals of light matter interactions using imaging and microscopy. And so we spend the entire year talking about light matter interactions of different sorts, really spending a lot of time talking about color and multiband photography, specifically from the visible to near infrared, because most conservation labs have a DSLR camera. Many of them have a modified DSLR camera. And so we have a lot of rotating advanced topics as well. But again, it's been interesting to realize that as chemical imaging becomes more prevalent in the field, it really behooves us to teach it at an earlier stage. And so this is why I decided to bring Misha into the course. And so in spring of 2025, we were lent a Misha system. And the students already knew about, the ideas of diffuse reflectance, already knew about multiband photography with a modified camera. They had seen a hyperspectral camera in action but never touched it. So it was really wonderful that we could build this system together and they could run it themselves to get data on their own projects. And in the spring, what I do is I have the students, each student or a pair of students has their own research project based in imaging and microscopy, and many of them actually use Misha to get it done. And so, for example, in this project-based course, we had three different objects, not palimpsests, but three different objects with media that could benefit from being looked at with multispectral imaging. So a 17th century work on paper with various types of drawing media on both sides, an 18th century dyed needlework that was extremely faded on one side, and then a 20th century silvered photograph print. And so these three objects, not books, not manuscripts redone, but just 2D objects with media on them, how could we use multispectral imaging to understand them better? So here's an example of the dyed needlework on the faded side. This is an object at the Winterthur collection where we can see that having done the imaging and going through principal component analysis, we can see that different dyes that might look similar are actually appearing differently in the PCA. And so this is something as a first step for the students to go, okay, I have different materials here. How can I push my line of inquiry further? I have to say that the textiles conservator was delighted to see that any sort of imaging beyond UV was being used on a textile. And so this has actually grown her interest on using more spectral imaging for textile-based objects. This is a 17th century drawing with mixed media. It's been attributed to Tiepolo. And one part of the drawing, we could see the drawing lines so well in a red iron oxide line. So very, very thin lines were appearing. We know there are washes in here as well. But another thing that stood out to us that wasn't quite noticeable before was this overlay and the attachment of the two papers that were highlighted in the green at the right through the PCA. And so again, the students were able to produce these really beautiful PCA images, highlighting through the false color images the different types of media used to execute these figures. And so they made for really beautiful visualizations and didactics and also presentation material. And so the students in their research projects presented on what they did. They talked about how they incorporated multispectral imaging into their workflow, having proceeded from multi-band. And I think one of the major outcomes here is that we are seeing early career conservators getting experience with multispectral imaging. And the faculty in our program could observe firsthand the benefit of multispectral imaging, both for the students' education as well as their own practice. And you could start to see interest pick up in, well, maybe we should be getting our own multispectral system. But one of the things that stood out to me, maybe as a not as a downside, but maybe a deficit in my own curriculum was that, they produced these beautiful images, but they didn't know where they came from. They just knew what multispectral imaging was. And so this actually brought in new lecture content this year into the course. So actually, with Donald Dahlberg from the Lebanon Valley College and Helder Carniero, my PhD student in chemistry, we developed two lectures actually on principal component analysis to really get the students ready for MISHA. So we wanted to teach them what is the benefit of multivariate data, what is chemometrics, what is principal component, and what is a scores image or those PCA images. And so I went really slowly through these two lectures showing different types of chemical imaging to justify why we do this and to justify what they're going to see coming out of MISHA. And so we were saved this morning by Tom Reiger, who sent us the pieces we needed, and we got set up really quickly. And I'm so happy I get to show some of the videos taken today of a textile object. It's actually a fiber sample book, an aniline dye fiber sample book. and just blew the students away. And so they're going to do a write-up where they talk about their observations and what they've learned from their object using multispectral imaging. This year is the first time we're using a full painting to look at, part of the painting, but we are using an oil painting to look at under MISHA and see if we can enhance some things. So that's the end of my presentation. I just wanted to show what MISHA is doing and the influence it's had on my curriculum and the Woodpack program.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Roxanne. That's fantastic. It's great to see just how much you've done in the past year to kind of thinking about it as a starting point and then bringing it further and bringing it further. So that's really exciting to see. So congrats on that. Open up for questions.
You need to go buy Helen's influencer tent because you're going to have glare, right? So yeah, that's awesome though. And the students take to it, no problem really.
Oh yeah, I have really great students, but I think that their comfort in doing multi-band imaging and with the DSLR the whole year, like applying the same concepts, like what is exposure time? What is f-stop? How do I make a better image? How do we adjust our setup and make this modular system work to our benefit with these non-traditional objects? And so to give them that confidence all year and to talk about like what these images are coming in, and then to come in and just see this very well thought out program that like held their hand on how to take the data, it was a no-brainer for them. So the final step is just how do they interpret the images and talk about their objects. Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. I see a question in the chat about when is hyperspectral imaging needed versus multispectral. So I mostly do hyperspectral imaging myself for my research. And really, I find that when you want to do material characterization, when you really want to understand the materials that are present in a manuscript or decorated object, to get that true molecular profile, you want the hyperspectral, especially, for example, if you have red lakes, if you want to tell the difference between madder and cochineal or kermes, you want that difference in the profile. If you want to see cobalt, a cobalt-based blue versus ultramarine, you're going to need that higher resolution of the bands. And so it's the difference between, do you just want to see differences in general materials? Multispectral is great. If you want to identify the materials, I think that going with hyperspectral is your best bet.
Yeah,
David,
we get that question all the time. People say, "Oh, I want to buy a hyperspectral instrument," and the first question is why? What are you trying to do? Because it's way more expensive and way more complicated, but it can do other things, right? So anyway, yeah, that's exactly right.
When I presented earlier, I'm not sure if you were here, Roxanne, but I talked about doing some of like the more traditional multi-band imaging that we do for conservation. So, UV fluorescence and, other types of filtered versions of the captures.
Yeah.
Do you see much benefit in just adding those to add more differentiation if you're not going for identification? That you're getting more things that are going to vary different under different lighting or filtering conditions into the mix when you're processing.
Can you clarify, like adding into the MISHA cube or?
So I guess if you build a cube manually instead of using the capture software, you can add additional images.
Yes, yeah. I mean, this is where spectral imaging came from. It's kind of why it started in the field. People were taking an X-ray, an infrared image, a UV image, and going, my brain can't handle all this information, but maybe a software can. So I think there is value to taking, your own UV reflectance multiband, your own UV fluorescence band. If you know how to do visible induced visible luminescence, I would do that. I do visible induced visible luminescence to isolate lakes from UV fluorescent materials. And I think that if you were comfortable with finding your own excitation filters and filters for the camera and keep just registration pretty well on your camera and don't bump things, like you could build your own cube for sure. And I think it would be advantageous. Yeah. Because we do actually, when people do infrared imaging, multispectral infrared imaging, they just do 3 large infrared bands and run a PCA or a maximum noise fraction transfer. And there's only 3 huge bands. So I think there's value if you want to throw your multi-band images into a cube.
Roxanne, I don't think you were on earlier today, but Rich's colleague, Robert from Yale, showed how he's been taking historical multiband imagery that they collected who knows when, separating the channels into individual TIFFs and just loading them up into our processing software and building a cube and then processing it, right? And so even with the multiband imaging that you guys are teaching off a modified DSLR,
yes,
you can probably start to introduce the idea of doing image processing to that data, as long as you get it all registered and things like that. So I think that's something that we're finding is really intriguing, that people are just, even without a MISHA system, they're starting to use the ideas and the concepts behind the image processing to get information out of things they might have collected years ago, right?
Right. I think the idea of repurposing our data is really important. And so a lot of folks out there are working on image registration algorithms. That's something we're concerned with, how to just even take 2D images and downscale, upscale the resolution, and then to be able to run it through even ImageJ. I mean, a lot of folks use ImageJ to run and build their multispectral cubes. So that was like a whole topic at the CHIPSy conference in California. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of value in trying to find ways to repurpose our data along with taking new data, right? There's so much information that's residual.
I did want to say, we see, or at least I see on the Zoom, Mark Strange, and I'm not going to call him out, but I will call him out. Mark is a specialist conservator of photographs and preservation at National Library of New Zealand and Aotearoa, and they are in the process of building their MISHA system. So just wanted to welcome Mark. We mentioned earlier today that New Zealand was in the build stages. If anybody else has general comments, general thoughts about this year's Worldwide MISHA, other comments or questions, happy to sort of transition to that, or other announcements or things.
Sorry, I wasn't able to join you at 5 a.m. when you started.
Hi, Mark. Good to see you.
It's wonderful to share this. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Happy you guys have decided to move forward.
Oh yeah, no, we're probably about a month away from actually doing the assembly, but the parts are trickling in.
Awesome.
We ordered the panels is it about a month ago now, Mark? We were all on a Zoom, like pressing the button to order together. So I think it's been about a month since you guys ordered them. So it's good job, good work.
Thank you for your help.
Of course, happy to. Anybody else want to share any comments or questions or thoughts?
I guess I will say that we have another venue for people to get together. We have our archive group, Rochester Cultural Heritage Imaging, Visualization and Education. We meet alternate Fridays at 1 Eastern Time, and tomorrow is one of them. And it's all on Zoom, and I'll put the meeting ID in the chat. People are welcome tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be an open meeting. We've been trying to get somebody to talk about IIIF, but the schedule hasn't worked out yet. She's hoping we can do it in 2 weeks. But everybody's welcome. It's very informal. And sometimes we always have fun, but sometimes people make some significant contributions.
So
Thank you, Roger, for doing that. Thank you for mentioning it. I did see Andy's comment here about given the difficulties with getting the LED boards. I will say, for those who weren't on the morning or the earlier afternoon call, we're trying to arrange, I've been doing quite a bit of research on having the LEDs sourced locally, so that it'd be a little bit easier, a lot easier for people to purchase them. And I will be sending out a survey, non-committal, non-binding, just getting a lay of the land to folks today about would you be interested in purchasing directly from a manufacturer in the US, just to get a sense of what that looks like. And also if you would be purchasing for yourself as a researcher or for your institution, which those are two very different things. So I can just speak to that part in general, but I don't know if Dave or Roger, if you wanted to respond to Andy's question in particular about a filter wheel system instead of the LEDs.
Yeah, Stephanie, you guys got in before it was difficult to purchase things from China, I think, particularly here in the US. Andy, the reason a lot of the high-end systems use filter wheels. They use colored LEDs and filter wheels, right? And there's a lot of good reasons to do that. When we originally designed the MISHA under the NEH program, we put some significant constraints on ourselves. One was no moving parts, because those will just eventually break. And we wanted to make sure that the system was useful by non-technical people who weren't going to be able, they might be out in the field someplace and, all of a sudden the filter wheel dies, right? So we were trying to keep the design as simple as possible. And we were very consciously said we were willing to trade the benefits of having a filter wheel for the simplicity of not having any mechanical or moving parts. It was just a design constraint. You could easily do it, right? You could easily put a filter wheel in front of our thing with a little stepper motor or something, and you could filter within the bands that we have for the illumination. You could even do things like filter out UV fluorescence at very specific wavelengths if you were trying to do spectral fluorescence measurements. That's what a lot of the high-end systems do. But it was just a design choice we made within the constraints that we placed on ourselves. I would only add to Roger's thing. I think I lost count of the number of different application spaces that people from this morning, this afternoon are using MISHA in classrooms, in teaching, both in medieval studies and art conservation, in the Middle East, in South Korea, studying music that's in Germany. It's been really, really amazing to see what all of you folks are doing with this little imaging system that we sort of created here in the lab. So I'm really, it's a tribute to your guys, I think, desire to push the field further, as well as your willingness to try things, right? Just try random things. And I think that's just great. And I think it's going to be huge for this community going forward.
Too. I agree. Anybody else want to share? Tom, I see your face still on there. Hopefully, if you want to chime in with anything.
Yes, I'm still here.
Any thoughts on anything? Anything you're cooking up that we need to know about? Don't make any promises, but anything you want us to know?
Well, there is more to come. I'll put it that way. All right. And my little workshop is chugging away, making things. But what I'm really amazed at is the year-over-year change in the MISHA program. How wide it's spreading, what it's being used for, the sophistication of how it's being used. Pretty amazing. So yeah, I'm glad to be a part of this. Glad to help out where I can. Thank you. Making parts for overnight delivery.
We can't promise that. That was just an awesome opportunity or sort of circumstance. So we can't promise that.
That was luck of timing that it all worked out. So
yeah. Roxanne, just so you know, in the old way of doing things on game shows, I messaged the email out to Dave, Roger, and Tom, and it said, phone a friend. Because it's like, Houston, well, I shouldn't use that analogy when we have NASA up, but, we wanted to make sure that whoever could triage at that moment, because I was still buried with grant work, but you all handled it, and thanks, Tom, for that. So.
Not a problem at all.
Thank you. Anything else?
I can't think of anything else. This has been great fun, guys. Thanks for sticking through it. I really enjoyed this. Time.
Yeah.
Thanks for all you do in this community, and you guys are doing some amazingly cool stuff. So, I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but I think there's a high probability next April 9th we'll be doing this again. This is starting to become an annual event, I think, and who knows where people will be in the world using MISHA systems by then. So that's exciting.
Yeah, a few more out there.
And if there's anything, so as organizer, if there's anything I can do to connect you with people. So if you saw someone here, you're like, hey, who was the person who did blah, blah, blah. I'm happy to provide that. One of my strengths and one thing I like to do is connect people. So feel free to reach out to me and I can send it to the various people that it needs to go to. If it's something that I need help with Dave, Roger, and Tom, I source it to them. So feel free. Or if you just want to know about other opportunities, we try to send things out through either archive or the MISHA Google group, which isn't very active because we don't want to bombard people. But as we have things that are available, so for example, Helen's thing for the influencer tent, people are going to get this email that says the influencer tent. They're not going to know. So if you know, you know, we'll send that stuff out on the MISHA Google group. But other things, feel free to send it to me and I can send it out to the group. Or otherwise, I'm happy to do that or to help connect you with people who are here or that you saw on the schedule and maybe you missed their presentation. So,
And I guess I would also add, if anybody has any suggestions for other ways we could meet, other things we could do.
Come to Rochester, friends. Come to Rochester. We've got dorms and they're not bad. Roger, Tom, and I stayed in them last year.
A whole lot better than they were in the 70s, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we are doing summer seminar, but if there's something else, like Jenny popped over for a day, if there's another, anyone is welcome to join us at RIT. We are happy to host people and have you come visit for specialized training if that's an opportunity that's open to you. So, all right. Well, I think we're done. Thank you so much, friends. It's good to see you all. Cheers and have a good night. And have a great day, Mark, down under.
Yeah, right. Good morning, Mark. Have a good rest of your day.
Good morning tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
That's right. Bye, friends. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.